We all live in the age of conspiracy, and it is your job to find as many unfiltered angles as possible on the truth so that you can triangulate what's real and avoid getting lost in spin. That's why, as we all march towards a hyper-divisive presidential election, I'll be bringing on more and more of the people at the center of this drama, and my goal is to map out their thinking and understand their base assumptions so I know where they're trying to take us. From there, hopefully, we can all see a wise path forward. In that spirit, I bring you entrepreneur and former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. Enjoy the episode. Vivek Ramaswamy, welcome to the show.
It's good to be back.
Dude, for people that don't know what you mean by back, so you and I filmed a much longer interview that we're going to get to here in a minute. But given the Trump verdict, we both felt that it made sense to come in and tie that up. In the longer interview, we talk about Trump, we talk about America, values, your purchase of Buzzfeed, all that stuff. But I'm not for Trump, against Trump, but even I had an emotional reaction to the verdict because it feels like people are politicizing the justice system in a way that makes me extremely nervous in terms of the impact that it's going to have on the voting public. And so I want to start there. What do you think, given your tweets, I assume you think this was a political takedown, miscarriage of justice, but what do you think is going to be the impact on the voting public's perception of our democracy and our justice system?
Look, I think it sets a pretty dangerous precedent. I have been pretty public about what my view is on the prosecution itself. And Tom, I'm happy to get into the legal meat of that if you're interested. I think for a number of reasons, this was not a subtle case, but an obvious case of prosecutorial abuse and the politicization of the justice system. I think if you had imagined Joe Biden on trial in Mississippi or Louisiana with the same set of facts in reverse, where you had a judge that had the other party affiliation and their own daughter raising funds off the trial, as you had in New York here. If you had a prosecutor who ran for office on the promise of going after Joe Biden, I think the left would be howling bloody murder here. And they would have a good point in that case, because even though I disagree with a lot of what Biden stands for, I don't think that that's the way justice should be carried out. Yet that's exactly the way injustice was carried out here. And so I can go into the legal basis for the case. One of the most appalling facts about this conviction is not just that it's the first time in U.S. presidential history that a former president and now a major frontrunner for U.S. president again was convicted of a felony. But what was most remarkable is if you're going to have that kind of historic conviction, it better be a black and white case. And yet the irony is, the judge's instructions to the jury were literally that the jury did not have to agree on what the felony crime even was in order to convict. And I think that's appalling. I think that that's a danger to every American. Now, what does that mean for the voting public? There, I have less strong convictions, right? I know what my views are on the facts. I know what my views are on the integrity of the justice system. So my views are set, but my predictions are softer, but I'll give you some of them since you asked anyway, is that I think this is going to have the effect of actually softening the perceptions of and winning over a lot of black voters to Trump. I think a lot of black voters have been for a long time telling both sides, hey guys, the justice system is not always as fair as you portray it. We have had numerous experiences, people in the black community would say, of justice that was not carried out fairly, in part because of the basis of somebody's skin color or the zip code where they were or biases of police officers. And now Donald Trump is suffering an unjust system, not on the basis of race, but on the basis of political belief. I think that eye-opening event for a lot of people to say that the justice system is not necessarily always a neutral or perfect system is something that if Trump leans into that message, I think will actually win the sympathies of a lot of black voters who have not felt heard for a very long time, frankly, by both parties, but the Republican Party included. And I think it's an especially important opportunity for Trump because he actually bucked the Republican orthodoxy and did something that Democrats had long promised to do but never delivered, which was actually criminal justice reform, which made sure that many of those people who were locked up weren't unjustly locked up for far longer periods of time for crimes that were not really proportionate to the magnitude of punishment that they were dealt. And so those two things, I think, actually go together. And especially combine that with Trump's travels to the South Bronx and other areas where traditional Republican candidates haven't gone. I think it's a package to really attract a lot of minority voters and black voters in particular. I also think that a lot of libertarian-minded Americans, race independent, but just ideology dependent, libertarians who are deeply skeptical of government overreach understand that the politicization of the justice system is the last straw, and I think should, and I think will be drawn to Trump as a consequence of this politicization and weaponization.
That's all really logical and, a sort of, you're up high looking down on something with a logical view. I'm way more worried about an emotional reaction that, if we're talking about January 6th, part 2, like, how do voters feel? My nightmare scenario is Trump doesn't get elected and voters say, yeah, obviously, because this was a complete manipulation of the public's view of Donald Trump. And so the people that believe in Donald, that are his base, they are going to go nuts because they will have a very easy thing to point at, which is the justice system was manipulated against them. This election was rigged. People have been saying that now for a while. So do you have any more visceral concerns about where this goes on election day?
Look, I have a lot of concerns where this goes for the future of the country. I mean, we have set a dangerous precedent now where the party in power is able to use the tools of prosecution to take the legs out from its political opponents. If you think that's going to end with this particular instance of going after Trump, think again. This is the beginning of, I think, a downward slide in this country unless we all, frankly, across the political spectrum, step up and say, enough with it, we're done with it, and actually restoring a neutral justice system. So it's not just this year I worry about. I worry about the future of the country. Because if you think about one thing that the United States of America depends on for our own rule of law and our own democratic way of life, it is an impartial judicial system. Once we lose that, I don't think we have a country left. So that's what I think is at stake. Now, do I think that that could manifest itself even in this election in public distrust of this electoral process? Absolutely. I mean, the whole system has basically said, we don't trust you, the voters, to decide who you're actually voting for. There have been headlines in the last several years saying the problem with democracy is the voters. So it's not like this is a novel idea. The people who are wielding the keys in the managerial class, something that we talk about in the longer form episode when you and I were together, is that they're skeptical of voters' ability to self-govern. And this is one of the tools they're using to say that we don't want you, the voters, to take the risk of reelecting Donald Trump. And so we're going to use prosecution as a substitute to make sure that doesn't happen. That's going to have drastic consequences at a moment where we're already skating on thin ice as a country. So if your question for me is, am I worried about this country being on the precipice right now and this potentially pushing us over the edge or too darn close to it? I am. I'm deeply worried about it, which is why I think it's important to be vocal. At the same time, I'm optimistic that the American people who they're trying to dupe aren't going to be so easily duped either. And that's the outcome I'm rooting for. And it's part of why I've taken the extra time and effort and pain to be as vocal as I can in explaining this, not just to the people who agree with us, because that's beside the point. We don't need more people preaching to their own choir, but maybe to audiences that aren't as plugged in, may understand a headline and say, oh, well, I don't want to elect a criminal to be the president of the United States. Yeah, but if that criminal isn't actually a criminal, but the judicial system just went through a sham to teach you that he was, to delude you into believing something that wasn't true, then that's something that actually will hopefully ignite a sense of purpose in people who care about saving our country, whether or not they're Republican.
What do you think about Trump's take? He said, this is a paraphrase, but he said, I don't know that the American people are going to stand for this, meaning his guilty verdict, and that there is going to be a breaking point at some point, or there may be a breaking point at some point. How are you reading that statement?
At face value. I mean, it's the basic fact that our country depends on an impartial judicial system. And if they can do it to Trump, they can do it to anybody. So I do think it's dangerous. I don't use that word lightly. I am deeply concerned about where we are as a country right now. This is not some ordinary election where we're debating tax policy. This is an election where the basic rules of the road are on the line. It is a kind of 1776 moment in this country, or dare I say, maybe even a bit of an 1860 moment in this country. And I don't want us to get there, but I think that is what's at stake right now. And it's interesting because Joe Biden ran on the promise of unifying the country. I think he's badly failed to deliver it. If Joe Biden really wanted to unite this country and keep his campaign pledge, there's one way he could do it. He could actually step up and say, you know what? I disagree like hell with Donald Trump on a lot of policies. And I think he would make a poor president, but I'm still going to pardon him because this should not be done through the justice system. And by the way, social media platforms, go ahead and at least lift the bans on my opponent, because the American people deserve to hear from my opponent. Even if I disagree with what he says, I will fight for his right to say it. That's how you unite a country. And Joe Biden has refused to do it. So he campaigned on uniting the country. He has a clear path, more than any president in U.S. history, I believe, certainly since Lincoln, to step up and actually unite the country. And he's squandering it. And I think that that's sad. It's deeply concerning to me as an American. It's deeply disappointing to me as a citizen of this country. That's something Joe Biden could do. Now, before we get a bunch of half-wit legal scholar wannabes that say, oh, no, Biden can't pardon Trump because this is a state crime. We can go into that bit if you want. Actually, the state crime here depends on the existing of an existing underlying felony charge in order for the state crime to be charged as a felony. So
I don't want to get lost in the nitty gritty of the law, but I think that advice
I just know a lot of social
Biden,
media. I know a lot of social media people will be like, oh, I know the law and Biden can't pardon him for a state crime. Let's just stipulate it for now. The state conviction depended on an underlying federal charge. So Biden, I believe, actually could pardon him. I've made this argument in the pages of the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. So go check that out if you're interested. But again, forget the plumbing of it. My point is Biden has a historic opportunity to unite this country. He is squandering it. And dare I say it, I think Donald Trump and the Republican Party now has an opportunity and an obligation to be the party that actually stands for national unity at a moment where we deserve it. And I think Trump is up for that challenge in a way that
how does he do that in this particular moment?
Yeah, look, I think part of it is demonstrating that he actually cares about national unity. And I know him. I know he does. I think one of the things that it's easier to see if you know him, but it's harder for the public to see, is he deeply cares about national unity. But I think his ability to gesture towards that, to even speak of it as an important value to him, I think will alone impact voters at a moment where we're longing for a leader who believes that we're one nation. I mean, I think there's a basic question on the table in this election this year, 2024. Are we actually one nation? Like, are we in a literal sense, not in a literal sense, in a near literal sense, in a meaningful sense? Are we actually one country, or aren't we? Right? Is there one America right now, or are there multiple Americas? Are there two Americas? Is there a Democrat America and a Republican America, a MAGA America and a progressive America, a Black America and a white America? If you read the pages of most major newspapers or turn on the media, that's what you're led to believe. If you watch modern partisan politics, that's what it looks like to many Americans. And I think that's actually a basic question. That's why I said we're in a 1776, or dare I say, even an 1860s style moment. I think a lot of people would pause today if you asked them that question, to think about it in a way that ought to concern all of us. I don't think that they would have paused to think about that 15, 20 years ago. But I think today, if you actually ask somebody, like, in a real sense, are we actually one country? That's what's on the table. I believe we are. I believe we're in our last window where that can be true, if we step up and actually speak to the ideals that unite us as Americans. I think one of the things I've enjoyed hearing Trump say on the campaign trail, and I've obviously spent some time with him in the last several months, and this is a direction where I think he should be going more, but leave it at that. But I love the way he's approaching some of his rhetoric about success. Success will be our vengeance. That's a line he's used several times, which I love. Success is unifying. I think Donald Trump does in his heart care about national unity, but even if he lets just the people of this country see that, that alone would have a palpable effect.
All right. We definitely go into deeper detail in that particular point in the longer interview. I know you got to bounce now, brother. Thank you for taking the time, and everybody at home, enjoy the rest of the interview. When did we stop being America 1.0?
It was not a moment in time. It was a gradual process that I think began with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. You familiar with this?
Yes.
Okay, so the Great Society was what I view as one of the great misnomers of American political history, where in the name of helping a particular segment of the population, the set of policies adopted actually had a destructive effect in 360 directions. A lot of this is what the progenitors are for the modern welfare state. But this isn't just a point about government redistribution or monetary effects of that on our debt and otherwise. It's deeper than that because it was the rise of a new philosophy that said that we, the people, could not be trusted to self-govern or live our lives the way we want. But instead, it's going to take an elite group of specialized technocrats and benevolent dictator-like leaders that look after your best interests. And I think that's really was, when you think about the America 1.0, what did that represent? That was our national founding. That was a group of founding fathers who said that for better or worse, I'm going to make my own decisions and self-govern, not to be governed by some monarch on the other side of the Atlantic who thinks he's acting in my best interest. And where we saw that change was the beginning of the Great Society was not just the redistributionist policies and the welfare and nanny state policies, but it was also the beginning of really legitimizing this administrative state, right? The idea of unelected bureaucrats that would enact a lot of regulations that we, the people, never passed, but to actually serve the interests, as they saw it, of we, the people. And I think a lot of the conservative backlash to this misses the essence of what's going on, right? The conservative instinct initially is that, you know what, we don't want a government that tyrannically overreaches and is hostile to me. But that misses the point where the people who are perpetrating it don't think of themselves as hostile to you. They think of themselves as actually looking after you. And that, I think, is the ultimate betrayal of America 1.0, is the idea that you can't be trusted to self-govern. You can't be trusted to self-determine the course of your own life. But instead, you in your life require somebody else to look after what's best for you. That's where we really, I think, got to this, I would say, what would you say? I want to put a descriptor on it, the 2.0 version that we live in today.
Okay, so if you say nanny state, that sounds terrible. But if you say that a government's job is to look after the people in the state, then it's like, okay, I get where we're going. You say things like, no, nobody's going to be left behind. Mm-hmm. Those things feel good. They make people feel protected. So if it is at least good in theory, why is it bad in practice?
Yeah, so I don't think it's good in theory. I think that you're right that certain descriptors can make it sound good, but I don't think it is the idea of a centralized body telling you that you're going to live your life in a different way and using coercive force to do it. I don't think is good in theory. I think it is bad even in theory. Now, I think it can be made to sound good because we all have internal vulnerabilities, right? Each one of us has certain insecurities, certain areas where we have our strengths but our weaknesses, and we want to be able to make sure that we're taken care of in the cases where those weaknesses go bad. That's at the heart of insurance, right? The whole idea of insurance, forget it whether it's government or private sector, but the concept of insurance is the idea that certain times things go badly. Sometimes that's out of your control. Even when it is in your control, part of it is you didn't inherit all of the vulnerabilities or failures that you have as a person. You insure against that, against a community of people who also have other vulnerabilities, but you pool that to say that, hey, as a community, it's in everyone's self-interest to come together to say that nobody is left behind. Well, I think that's a beautiful thing when you're talking about freely consenting adults getting together and looking at what's in their best interest, but without denying their own agency. I think when you create a government structure that is instead in charge of determining what is or isn't in your interest, you actually forfeit that agency itself. So the idea of in a team or in a family unit, let's just start with that. It's a good organizing principle to start with. Aristotle started there. He thinks of the family as more fundamental unit of governance than the state. Most great countries through human history, most great societies have been built the same way. Well, in a family unit, the same way is you say that no family member left behind. That's the way that, I would like to be a member of my family. We're not going to leave each other behind because that's just how we do it. We're a family unit and that's who we are. Not because there's going to be coercive force that my wife or I apply to each other or, to adult grown children. Parent-children relationships is a little bit different, but you're talking about even a family unit of grown adults. You're not talking about necessarily a parent coercing an adult child to do something. My relationship with my parents or my relationship with my kids when they're grown up, is not going to be based on coercion, but it's just based on the idea that as a family, we look after each other's best interests because that's where our commitments are. I see the same spirit that we're actually missing at a national level amongst citizens, right? We as citizens are also in a relationship with each other. And I do think part of what we're missing in our country is that sense of civic duty that we owe to one another and that we owe to our nation. And in some ways that our politicians who we elect owe back to us. And so I believe it's not an accident that it's precisely at a point in our history where the politicians who we send to Washington, D.C. and the bureaucrats who write the regulations are no longer behaving as though they owe their sole moral duty to our own citizens, that our own citizens have lost their sense of civic duty to our nation. I think those two things go together. But that idea of a duty-based commitment, I believe, can be and should be totally separate from the idea of a government using coercive force to tell you what's best for you. And that's what's at the heart of the modern administrative state. That's what's at the heart of the modern federal government in the post-Lyndon Johnson Great Society era that we're in. And so if we're going back to how do we eradicate that root disease and really, I think, deliver a lot of the liberation that we hunger for in our modern American moment, it's to undo that premise, the idea that we, the people, create a government that is no longer accountable to us, but who is responsible for us. I think that's the root cause.
If you want to reach your full potential this year, you have got to focus on providing yourself with the best possible building blocks for your brain and body. And that is why I recommend ButcherBox. You guys know ButcherBox is a huge part of my life because they go above and beyond to source only high quality and humanely raised meats and seafood. This includes 100% grass-fed beef, free-range organic chicken, humanely raised pork, and wild-caught seafood, all shipped for free and delivered directly to your door. This year, get exactly what you need to hit your healthy eating goals. ButcherBox is offering our listeners their choice of meat, bone-in chicken thighs, hop sirloins, or salmon for free in every order for a whole year. Plus, get $20 off your first order. Sign up today for this incredible offer at butcherbox.com/impact and use code IMPACT to choose your free offer and get $20 off.
Okay, there's an interesting tension in there for me in that I think people, especially in a time as tumultuous as the one that we're living through right now, people really will make some very extraordinary trade-offs between safety and freedom. And when I think about the reality on the ground of when you have personal responsibility as a driving factor, when it's like, hey, you're going to get this from your local family, your community, your church, your whatever, those are going to be the people that pick you up when you fall down. Some people really will get left behind. Some people will literally die in the streets. And how do we deal with that cogently?
Yeah. So look, I think let's start from a premise of basic concern for the dignity of every person. Okay. Now let's ask ourselves, are those policies that we are adopting in the name of helping such persons actually helping them or not? Right? Because I think there's a separate question of whether an ideal state of affairs is ever possible. If God created a world in which there is human suffering, it should at least cause us to pause to say whether a government can eliminate all forms of that human suffering. We should at least ask the question and suggest as a premise that there's three possibilities for what the government action could do. It could do nothing. It could make that human suffering worse in the name of trying to attempt to help that human suffering, or it could make that human suffering better. It could do, in principle, those are your three options. I think the evidence would suggest, particularly in the post-Lyndon Johnson Great Society view of the world, the post-Woodrow Wilson administrative state, technocracy, bureaucratic vision of the world, the very actors who have, I think in some ways, earnestly set out to make the lives of the disempowered better, what they've done is actually make the lives of that very disempowered class worse. And they made the lives of everyone worse in the process. I'll give you a good example of this. Look at family formation and the rates of family formation in the United States of America. For the very groups, the demographic groups that the Great Society was supposed to actually help. And I'll say, why am I asking the question about family formation? It's a relatively arbitrary variable, you could say, to focus on, and it's a fair question. Here's why. if you grow up in a two-parent household, you are more likely to graduate from high school. I think like 8 times more likely to graduate from high school. You are 8 to 10 times less likely to end up in poverty or in prison. If you look at every kind of outcome for prosperity and well-being, health, happiness, it's off the charts for people who grow up in a stable two-parent household. Does that mean you can't achieve those metrics just because you didn't? Of course not. But I'm talking about at a population scale, no doubt about it, from economic to happiness to well-being to avoiding crime to actually living a free and prosperous life, unambiguously better for kids of every skin color. This goes across race, goes across gender boundaries, goes across all demographic boundaries. You are better off growing up in a stable two-family environment. So then you look at the incentives created by Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. What has that done? Over the course of the last 60 years, the very populations, in this particular case, there was a particular vision of lifting up black populations in the United States. That was one of the premises of the Great Society. It has actually had the impact of reducing and degrading family formation. Family formation rates were much higher in black communities. This is true for all communities, but especially true in black communities in the 1950s and 1960s than they are today. And that is no accident that you've actually seen relative economic stagnation in black prosperity in America over that same 60-year period as you've seen increased prosperity in other demographic groups. So in the name of helping a particular community, why is that? They create the incentives where single mothers can actually get more money now by not having a man in the house than by having a man in the house, even though that incentive was created in the name of helping that actual family, right? Well, put yourself in the shoes of a single woman growing up with a child in the house. You know what? I'd rather be married to Uncle Sam than to some guy who's not quite bringing in the same income that federal government's giving me. But that creates the disincentive to have that man in the house to aspire to fill those gaps in the first place. So I don't blame people who respond to incentives, but I do blame a government and a broad set of institutions around that government that have created those perverse incentives. I'm not going to go in the direction of questioning the motives of many of those individuals. You could do that in certain cases, and cynically, I think there are certain actors who view the whole thing as a laughing affair. There's some version of the world in which Lyndon Johnson might have been one of those people, actually. If you listen to a lot of the closed-door conversations that he had and his attitudes towards black Americans, it's not a rosy picture relative to the so-called public policies that he proclaimed to espouse in the name of helping them. But put the question of intentions to one side. Even if you assume that most people who are engaging in this project have basically benevolent intentions. I mean, King George thought of himself as having benevolent intentions, that these subjects, not citizens, but these subjects could not be trusted to do what's in their own best interest. They require me to be able to make sure that they don't, in the modern sense of the world, burn their planet down and burn down the environment in which they live by spawning modern climate change or fight themselves to pieces by creating inequalities. They don't know they're going to do that. They require me as a benevolent dictator. That's not what King George was concerned about, but I'm translating it to the kinds of concerns that King George would have in the present. It is a kind of benevolence, really, that spawned this type of overgrowth of both the nanny state as well as the administrative state. But you asked me when we went off track of who we were the first time around, what made America great the first time? What made America great the first time is embracing the spirit that we as a people are free, that you're not riding some tectonic plate of group identity, but that you are endowed by your creator with your own free will to achieve anything you want in your life with your own agency and hard work and dedication. Okay, maybe not anything you want in your life because every one of us has different God-given gifts. But at least that you get to maximize your God-given gifts, even if they're different than my God-given gift or anybody else's God-given gift in this room. Each of them is different, but we live in a country where you can achieve the maximum of that God-given potential without any government standing in your way, even if that means that that government isn't exactly the party that lifts you up to achieve it either. It might be your family, might be your own experience, it might be your own community, it might be your pastor, it might be your congregation, it might be all of those things. But it's not going to be some government that lifts you up, but it certainly isn't going to be some government that stands in your way either. So you could call that a libertarian view, and in a certain sense I am a libertarian in a certain sense of that word. I've identified as a libertarian for much of my life. I think I don't call myself a libertarian anymore because I care about more questions than just the relationship of the state to the individual. But I think America was, in a deep sense, libertarian at its founding, that we're the pioneers and the explorers, the unafraid, the people who could accomplish the maximum of what we're able. Are there going to be, is there any such thing as a perfect state of the world when that world is comprised of fallen human beings like us? No, I don't think that there is such a thing as a state of perfection on this earth. But the idea that a government striving to create that through coercion is going to create a better society as a result, I think has been a concept that we've disproven time and again over the course of history. And that doesn't mean that we should be callous or have disregard to people who struggle. To the contrary, I think what we've done with the overgrowth of a federal nanny state is we have crowded out the fellow instincts of empathy and compassion and respect and dignity that we confer to one another through other modes of community, through family, through local networks, that we've in some ways lost and degraded in the context of a government that has played that role instead.
There's a really famous quote by Vladimir Lenin, not history's greatest man for sure, but the quote's pretty powerful.
He's an interesting guy.
I
don't agree with him on much of what he said.
Lord. But his quote was, "Give me just one generation of youth and I'll change the entire world." He wasn't wrong. He, however, pointed his generation of youth at a set of values that was just absolutely destructive to Russia and cost untold millions of lives.
Yeah.
What I hear you talking about now is a set of values. It's trade-offs. There is no perfect world. There's no, as Thomas Sowell said, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. So if you had a generation of youth, what values would you point them at, such that you don't have to rule by fiat from the top down, that it will actually grow up from the bottom?
So I think the beauty of the American founding, and this goes to the answer to your question, is that there's a tension in there, because I'm going to point you to two values that in principle are in tension with one another, but actually that tension is a beautiful thing. On one hand, it is that you are an individual with total agency and free will to determine what you make of your life. The number one person who's in power to determine what you achieve in your life is you. I don't think that should be a controversial thing to say. I think that is—
It's extremely controversial.
I don't think it should be controversial, right?
I'm with you on that.
So in fact, I think delivering any message other than this to a child who is understanding their own agency, I think is actually morally wrong. I think it is a form of psychological slavery to tell a kid that what you're able to achieve in your life, that there is someone else other than you who's the biggest determinant of that. That's what we teach kids today. But my number one message, you're talking about teaching the kids of the next generation, the simplest principle without any fancy language attached to it is the number one person who determines what you will achieve in your life is you. Period. It's not a government. It's not somebody else's invisible power that they're exercising over you. I'm not saying that those things don't exist, but the number one, if you're going to rank order the 1,000 factors that are going to determine what you achieve in your life, unambiguously for every one of you, the number one determinant of what you achieve will be you and your own actions and your own choices that you make. That's number one. The second principle, I told you there's two, and they go together, is that as you do it, you are still in a relationship with your fellow citizens. I'm going to talk about this at a national level because you asked about it in the context of a nation, so I'll answer at a national level. You're in a relationship with your citizens, with your fellow citizens, that is co-equal at its core. That you may go on to achieve more or less than your neighbor as measured by the numbers of green pieces of paper or the size of your house or the level of acclaim that you get in the modern world, the number of social media followers you have, whatever the artifice of the generation may be. Regardless of the green pieces of paper or equivalent social media followers or whatever metric you care about, regardless of the material differences between you and your neighbor, you are still fundamentally in a relationship with each other as co-equal citizens. You are equal at your core in the way that matters. You're equal in your moral worth, and that you have a civic duty a duty to each of your fellow citizens that they have back to you, regardless of what each of you go on and achieve. So I think that that's at the heart of what it means to be an American, actually, is both of those things. On one hand, it's individualism. On the other hand, it's unity. Individualism and unity. Capitalism and democracy. Right? 1776 includes both of those things. It's a fun historical fact that 1776 was both the year that The Wealth of Nations was written. That's Adam Smith's seminal text that at least provides, widely viewed as providing the clearest statement for modern free market capitalism. Same year as the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, that led to the birth of the American Republic. So those two things are in tension with each other, right? Individualism and unity, capitalism and democracy. But that tension rests within each of us. There's two parts of each of us. The part of us that's a self-interested individual and a capitalist, the part of each of us that's a citizen with a civic duty to our country. And I don't view those as contradictory. But if you're asking me, what two values would I impart to the next generation to really create a country that revives the principles of our founding and maybe even goes far further than we ever have, those would be both of those principles I think are equally important to impart, is that the number one determinant of what you achieve is you, and you should be unconstrained in achieving it. But number two is at every step of the way, no matter what you do or don't achieve, we're all still co-equal in the most important way in our moral worth as citizens. And we have to regard each other and behave towards one another accordingly. That's what I would say.
Okay, I agree very much. However, there's a change that happened maybe because of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, but you have a philosophical change in this country where, by way of my own personal collision with the change in ideology, happened when I wrote the blog article that I thought would change the most people's lives. And I honestly, when I put it out, I thought people were just going to be like, bro, you just changed my life. I can't thank you enough. And it triggers everybody whenever I talk about this. But this is the true article that I wrote. If you are hit by a drunk driver, it's all your fault. And the goal
that was the title of the article?
Yeah.
Oh, very interesting.
And keep in mind, the whole time I'm writing, I'm like, oh man, I'm giving you the secrets to the universe. You're going to love this. It's going to change your life. Because what I'm trying to remind people, one, obviously I would not reuse fault if I were going to rewrite this, because that's just where everybody derailed. What I'm trying to get people to understand is you can make a different choice and get a different outcome. And if you're always looking at life through the lens of solutions, like, oh, I can do a different thing and get a different thing, you can remain in control of your life. So for me, the reason that the idea of self-determination should be the thing that you are embracing with every fiber of your being. The reason I think that that's effective is it puts you in the driver's seat. Now, the bad news is there are going to be wildly divergent outcomes. Different people are better at different things. And if you lack in some area, you just may never be successful. But what I want to understand is at this moment in time, I would say that the vision for I should be taken care of. What are you talking about? Like, we need to redistribute wealth. Like, this is grotesque that some people can get so rich and other people are literally going to die in the streets. Here are these two rich people talking about how other people like need to remember that they can have self-determination. Self-determination, like everything in the world is messed up. I can't afford a house. I'm in crippling debt from my student loans and I can't discharge it. And when Joe Biden tries to pay it off, you guys stop him at every turn. Like, it's just the whole world is fucked and you're telling me to go make something of myself. That message has captivated not one, not two. We're talking 3, maybe 4 generations of people. And I want to know, why is that so compelling? And why is it so hard to get people to recognize, from where I'm sitting, if you want to be a superhero, you need only adopt personal responsibility. Like, it's the most liberating, empowering, useful, just fanatically great thing you could ever take on. But that sounds ridiculous to young people.
Well, I think you got to acknowledge the powerful argument for the other side, which is sometimes you do get hit by a drunk driver and it's not your fault. Sometimes you do get swept away by a tornado, right? And your house crashes to the ground and people die in natural disasters or other forms of accidents that aren't their fault all the time. So that runs in the face of the idea that the only determinant of your own success or well-being is you. But that's not what I said in the very beginning. That's why I tried to frame it exactly precisely. Of the thousands of factors that will determine what you are able to achieve for yourself in your life, the number one most important factor is you. And I think if we acknowledge that truth, I don't like to peddle fake optimism. I don't like to peddle fake self-help doctrines just for the sake of you believing that's going to make you better off. It's also got to be grounded in truth, right? And so is it true that if you deliver that message to people, you said you find this compelling, and I don't disagree with you that it's going to motivate them to do more. Great. It could do that, but I don't believe in perpetuating that message just because it's going to have a positive effect. It also has to be true. So do I think it is true that you are the only person who has any say in what you achieve in life and that you can achieve anything you want with your own hard work and dedication? No, I don't think that's true. Might that be a motivating message? It could be a motivating message for the time being, but it's going to be short-term motivating because pretty soon you're going to run into obstacles in your life that teach you that that's just not true. When I was a kid, I wanted to play in the NBA. I'm 6 feet tall. Now, I guess there's some people who are 6 feet tall make it to the NBA, but I also don't have a lot of other skill sets required to compete at the highest level of basketball that no matter how much I worked, it was never going to happen for basketball or even for tennis or any other sport. Well, each of us has different God-given gifts. And that's just a fact. And no matter how hard I worked or how dedicated I was, that wasn't going to happen. There are other people who inherit genetic diseases or diseases of other kinds that that through no fault of their own will limit how long or how comfortably they're able to live their life. That's just not in your control. But here's what I will say is each of us has our own unique God-given talents. And nobody can stop you from achieving the maximum of your God-given potential, or at least you are the person who has the most agency over that. And I actually think that with that modification, I find that to be a more inspiring message because that's actually true. I think when you think about it, it's incontrovertible. What other factor is going to be more influential on that than you, especially at the level of a population? There isn't one more than that. So now we're talking about that being true. Why do people find that inspiring? It's because it's true, actually. Now, today, is there a part of each of us that still, has an addictive tendency, right? Do you have that drink of alcohol for an alcoholic because he thinks it's actually better for him while he's drinking it? No, I don't think so. Do you think that spending that extra hour of time at 11 o'clock before you go to bed on scrolling through social media is necessarily good for you? Are you doing that because you think that's actually better for you, or you're doing it just because it's a thing that you feel through impulse compelled to do? We're fallen human beings. We're not gods. So in that same sense, if you are offered some level of, if a drug addict offered cocaine, is saying yes to that good for you just because you do end up saying yes? No, it's not. And so I think what I see with the modern government is we're showering cocaine on a bunch of cocaine addicts, claiming that it's better for them because that's what they're clamoring to want, when in fact, that's not better for the very people you're purporting to help. And I think you can separate both of those things. That's the way I look at it.
So I think, let me see how quickly I can set the table for what I really think is going on. So I think that from an evolutionary standpoint, it is simply true that the world is going to break into what we'll roughly call right and left. I'll define them quickly. If you're going to create a species that passes on its information through culture, then you know that the organism as a collective is the thing that is our best safety. It's the way that we move forward. We're not the strongest, fastest, sharpest clawed, anything like that. So our ability to function together in gigantic numbers flexibly is the thing that we're obscenely good at and why we're the number one predator the world has ever seen. Okay, so I'm nature. You can use God, whatever. God set a thing in motion to give cohesion to the group. A rough break right and left. On the left, this is about compassion. I want to make sure that nobody's left behind. I want to make sure that people are looked after and cared for. I want to make sure that I'm contributing to the group. Super important, because if you're not contributing to the group, then you're not going to have group cohesion. Okay. On the right, you're basically addressing, from an evolutionary standpoint, the game theoretic reality that if you are never going to leave anybody behind, you're going to get freeloaders. And so if there's nobody to combat the freeloaders, you get such a parasitic load on the society that it also falls apart. So you need this dynamic tension between the left and the right. And if either one of them gets out of balance, you get pathology. Now, right now, I see massive pathology on the left. We've become so obsessed with the idea of nobody left behind, that getting wealthy is evil. We are in the grips of a set of ideas that I think don't yield results. And worst of all, we don't have a value that mandates that we look at the results to say, are we moving in the right direction? And even if we did have that, we wouldn't agree on what results we ought to be striving for. And then one last piece I'll put in this. These ideas are extremely complicated and very nuanced, and it is ridiculously difficult for people to think through these problems. And now I'll be unintentionally inflammatory, but this is just true from where I'm sitting. Intellect plays a role. And this is how you get the idea of the elites. There are some ideas that are so complicated. Take modern monetary theory. It is financial suicide. And yet you get a lot of people that go to bat for it. Now, how do you, as an average person, think through the complexities of monetary policy? You don't. You're going to have to outsource that to somebody. There are going to be a group of elites that are very happy to take up that banner and be, don't worry, Timmy, I'm going to think through this for you. And all you have to do is vote for this candidate. All right. That is the very tip of an excruciatingly large iceberg. But when you have the need for dynamic tension between people who want to support the group, and you have people that want to stand up for your individual rights and you need to take personal responsibility and do your thing, but that both of them tend towards pathology when unchecked by the other, but you're living in an algorithmically driven world where each of them only sees their own side. How do we disseminate the values that you're talking about in a way where we can actually where we can meet in the middle, where we long to hold each other in that dynamic tension?
Yeah, it's a beautiful framing. I think there's a couple things I would say. One is the punchline of how you get to the answer that you just talked about is two things. One is I don't think that there are necessarily just two types of people. I think that impulse actually exists if we're willing to admit it within each of us. I think a lot of people on, as you put it, right or the right, you could call it classically conservative folks, will embrace the individualism side, the rugged individual, the rugged capitalist, but without admitting that they also hunger to be part of something bigger than themselves. That's where a lot of their that's where their patriotic instincts come from, right? Why do a lot of people who have such impulses also have their own children or themselves who have served in the military along the way? That's not explained by just the mentality of how do I just achieve the maximum while minimizing freeloading, right? That behavioral pattern can't be explained. And I similarly think that a lot of people who still worry about who worry a lot about collective well-being still have individual ambitions that go beyond just the collective. And so I think that instinct actually doesn't just exist within a society. I think it exists within parts of each of us ourselves. Now, how do you actually that's an observation which would be my framing would be slightly different than the evolutionary split between the two camps.
Well, so
of people
one thing
in a society.
As you frame your answer, one thing to hold in your mind is you must explain what I see, right? Any theory has to account for the world that I actually have before me. So either challenge me that these two sides don't go pathological. And I mean, I can pick a society and I will tell you whether they broke pathological right or pathological left, or whether they're currently walking that dynamic tension. Do you agree that even though they're rough approximations, and I totally agree that everybody is on a spectrum of both, but do you agree that these large tendencies exist at the population level?
I want to think about that for a second. I think as a correlation, as a general trend, I think it does. As a general trend, it does. But you want to give you an example of something that counters your hypothesis, right, in this framing.
Please.
Because, the way you view the world is through a bunch of different lenses. And
they're all distorted.
But you try on each one, as the analogy I would use, like a set of clothes, and nothing fits quite perfectly, but you try it on, and each lens has a certain aspect of it that fits and a certain aspect that doesn't. I think that the best counterexample I could give you is a lot of people who would fall on the right end of that spectrum that you just laid out still make sacrifices for their country, such as serving in their military and putting their lives on the line, that would not be explained by just falling in the self-interested, self-maximizing, minimized freeloading category, right? And I think that theory would fail to account for the population level sorting when you see individual behaviors or even large-scale charitable instincts, right? Like, where does that charitable instinct come from? Where does the philanthropic instinct come from somebody whose sole goal is to minimize freeloading and maximizing individual achievement? It would neither explain family participation in the military, nor would it explain individual philanthropy. And so there, I think, are some just large-scale examples that would not undermine, but at least cut against that framing. And any framework you use is going to be imperfect, but that would put pressure on your framework. Those would be examples. But to the punchline of the question you asked, one of the areas where I think you would be able to find a common ground, what you call the middle — I never use the word middle because I rarely view a spectrum as monodimensional anyway. But one of the areas where you might be able to find a productive equilibrium there is that many of the actions that a society might take in the name of helping those who are furthest left behind are failing to actually help those who are supposedly further left behind. And I think that is a basis for at least finding some equilibrium, some basis of common ground to say, at least here's our principle. John Rawls actually offered this. I mean, there's very little ground you and I are going to cover that has not been covered over the course of human history. We're just going to revive those conversations in a modern context. Occasionally you might break new ground, but 99.9% is going to have been covered already. John Rawls covered this idea in what he called his Maximin principle, that all else equal, if you were behind a veil of ignorance, right? So his whole theory was — have you heard of this guy, John Rawls?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So he's kind of viewed as the intellectual father of modern classical liberal thought. His whole premise was, if you sit behind the veil of ignorance, that's how you should actually design a society. Is what's a just society? What's the theory of a just society? It's one where if we were all standing behind this black curtain and this black veil, and we don't know where we're going to end up on the other side. Are you going to become a businessman, or are you going to become somebody who's a pauper on the street begging for food on a daily basis in the third world? You don't know where you're going to end up across the entire globe, what stature or situation you're going to have in life or be born into. You have no idea. What society would we design if we're behind that proverbial veil of ignorance? That's where the expression veil of ignorance actually comes from. And the principle he comes up with is what he calls, I think he referred to the Maximin principle, which is that the society we would design is one in which every policy or rule we adopted was one that was best for the people who were worst off. Okay? Now you could debate what those policies are. I'm not a Rawlsian. I don't agree with that, but I can entertain that, right? I think that it's coherent. I think it's intellectually compelling. And I think it's also a basis for at least attacking many of the supposed policies that in today's actual practical world are designed to help those who are worst off. Let's just find common ground to start there first. Are they actually helping those who are worse off? And I think we have a long list of improvements that we could make across people who fall into both of those camps, right? So the first point I made is I don't exactly agree with the framing of those two camps, but I think it's a fair and useful framing. So let's play with it for a second. Playing within that framework that you laid out, which I think is interesting, your question was, assume you're right about that framework, how do we actually find some common ground and do something that everybody in that society would agree with? I'd say let's apply a principle. I'm not a Rawlsian, but let's apply a Rawlsian principle for the sake of this exercise and say that are all of the policies that we're adopting, such as those that are Lyndon Johnson's Great Society policies and its progeny, actually helping the people who were worst off where they were designed to help? And I think the answer to that question alone is unambiguously no.
What metrics would you use? to benchmark against?
Prosperity, economic mobility, family formation, happiness, drug usage, imprisonment. Economic prosperity is a proxy for other forms of prosperity that we could use as a rough proxy as well. So that's what I would say. Suicide rates, life expectancy, actually, which in the United States is not necessarily where we would want it to be as a leader of the free world. So I think that and relative metrics of the United States compared to other countries, including for those who are worst off in the United States. And so the argument, of course, by people on the other side is we didn't go far enough, right? You could always argue that. But you could also compare where we were in the 1950s for some of the very populations who we were supposedly helping, who actually were politically less advantaged than they are even today. We're talking about pre-Civil Rights Act for minority populations like black populations in the United States where you lacked political equality. But on the economic metrics, actually we're surprisingly not really worse off than today, even after this redistributionist project, came into existence. And so anyway, you're asking, what's a first step towards finding common ground? I think one first step is, we're not going to get to 100% agreement on this, but I think you're going to get some significant mileage out of this is, even if we all just temporarily agree, are the policies or projects that we've adopted to lift up those who are worse off, are they actually lifting up those who are worst off? And I think right now we're failing on that metric alone. Now, at the end of that, we're still going to have some residual disagreements remaining, right? And then the question is there anything a government could do to further benefit those who are worst off versus other institutions taking care of that load instead? I mean, are we sure that a revival of faith in this country, for example, might not be a more effective way of fulfilling the human need for purpose and well-being and providing you a roadmap for how you want to live your life better than a government otherwise would? I'm not saying that could be done centrally, but I'm saying that the way this country is going to be saved isn't necessarily going to be by some person running a government either. Maybe the revival of parents, fathers and mothers both, or pastors or coaches, each playing their own respective roles in saving this country too. I think that's one of the traps that the redistributionist model or the collectivist model falls into, is thinking that all solutions necessarily must be delivered by one modality of this thing we call government, versus actually recognizing that in this real world that we live in, not some theoretical world, but in the real civic world we live in, we're not going to be saved by some president or some Lenin or figure coming from on high to save us. That if we're going to be saved, it is going to be because we save ourselves in other ways as well. And so I think that's how we'll get to the further than the first step, but at least as a first step where I think we would find a lot of common ground before we started having more philosophical disagreements. We even in the face of those philosophical disagreements of being a collectivist versus an individualist, you could look at the litany of policies that are not actually helping the very people that they purport to help. And I think we've got plenty of mileage and plenty of juice to squeeze out of that before we get to actual deeper philosophical disagreements that divide us. That's where I think we are now. Does that make sense?
If you're struggling to find the perfect gift for your dad this Father's Day, get him an unexpected gift that brings you closer together with an Aura digital frame. Aura frames are beautiful Wi-Fi connected digital frames that allow you to share and display unlimited photos from anywhere. I love how simple it is to upload photos from any phone with the Aura app. And if you're giving the frame as a gift, you can even personalize it with preloaded photos and memories. Aura frames were named the best digital photo frame by Wired and selected as one of Oprah's favorite things 3 times. And right now, Aura has a great deal for Father's Day. Listeners can save on the perfect gift by visiting auraframes.com/impact to get $30 off their best-selling frame. That's AURA frames.com/impact. This deal ends June 18th, so do not wait. Use code IMPACT at checkout to save. Terms and conditions apply.
It does. To me, this is far less a philosophical question and more the answer to the question of, this is my worldview. We are all in the grips of a set of ideas. That set of ideas creates what I call a frame of reference. Your frame of reference is the whole life beer goggles that distort everything you see. You have no sense that you're wearing them. Sure. Your frame of reference is built up effectively from your beliefs and your value system. Most people confuse those with just objective truth. I just see the world the way that it really is. But that isn't true. from where I'm
And
sitting.
this is the whole point of the veil of ignorance, right? Because when you're in the society, then you're going to see it from the vantage point that you're in. But is it possible to have a view from nowhere, a view from the other side of the veil?
It's interesting. The veil of ignorance is itself a frame of reference. So I would say that's not quite true. What Rawls is saying there, and he may be totally unaware, I'm not familiar enough with his thinking to know, but he may be completely unaware that he has a frame of reference. And so he has a sense of where we should march people towards. And he is going, oh, I know where we need to get them. Let's say he rounded it to human flourishing. That's certainly me projecting. And he's thinking, what's the best way to get there? But what I'm saying is you need to recognize that you have somewhere that you're trying to get people, which is why I think it's very interesting that you at least have a metric by which you're saying, hey, I'm going to state where we're trying to get people. And I'm going to give you a KPI by which we're going to determine whether we got people there. And the KPIs that you gave us, economics, or are people making enough money? Are they doing drugs? Family formation, life expectancy, happiness. Like you had a bunch of really
incarcerated for breaking the laws, all that. Yeah.
It's all amazing. So now you and I have the same desire, which is to say, okay, I'm literally not trying to ask you a philosophy question. I'm trying to ask you, this is going to become tactical.
Okay.
So whether you are a future president, which I think a lot of people that saw you move are like, yeah, if bro wants to keep going, like there's more here, potentially VP, or maybe it's, hey, Buzzfeed, and you start going after the world in the way that you're historically more prone to do through business. But anyway, we ultimately have to find a set of ideas. So for the sake of argument, let's say that you were advising Trump or you were in Trump's cabinet. How do you begin to make policies? Because I think we both agree that people will follow the incentives. Right now, the government has become the vehicle of incentive distribution, incentive creation, however we want to think about that. But that is where the incentives lie right now.
Yeah.
So how do we leverage either the stripping down of the government apparatus or the refocusing of the government apparatus to create the incentives that will give us good outcomes in economics, drug use, family, incarceration, life expectancy, happiness, et cetera?
Yeah. So getting more practical from the philosophy to the practical. I enjoy the philosophy discussion. There's one critical element that we didn't cover that I want to come back to because I was operating within your frame. I'll just say a word about it, and then if you want me to come back to it later, which is one metric on that list that I didn't include, but that's really important. I think it's foundational, is the degree of mutual respect that we have for one another and the sense of respect that every citizen experiences. So you think about health outcomes, incarceration outcomes, economic outcomes, educational outcomes, all of that is important. One metric that's intangible and that it's difficult to measure, but is really foundationally important is what is the sense of respect and regard that every individual experiences as a citizen of that nation. I think that's really important. I think we're doing
for each other.
Yes, but for each other, but that one person feels in that society that they are receiving as a citizen. Do you feel like you are respected as a co-equal citizen by your fellow citizens? I think that that's a really, really important metric where we're doing particularly poorly right now.
That feels like it's doing work for a different idea. Is that doing work for class? Hey, whether you're rich or poor, you should feel equally respected.
Yeah, rich or poor, and class is actually today in America is actually not principally divided just based on wealth. Actually, class is almost a separate metric.
Tell me more. What do you mean?
Well, I think that there's a lot of people who, I mean, even if you take part of Donald Trump's rise, is he represents membership in a class that is different than the people who might have similar net worths but view themselves as a member of a different class. Right?
I do not track.
You don't track. Interesting.
Can you give me specifics?
Yeah. Look, I think that an artist, a relatively 30th percentile of income person who is a graduate of, I don't know, the Rhode Island School of Design or Haverford College in Brooklyn, New York, who, has coffee at the local coffee shop and shops in certain types of decorates in certain types of art stores that they decorate their loft apartment with, thinks of themselves and their peers view them as fundamentally as a member of a different class than a guy here in central Ohio who has built a plumbing business that has an average income that's higher than the artist in Brooklyn, but there's still a certain classism where the level of respect that the self-operating plumber here in Ohio feels in his society in which he lives is lower as a level of respect that he feels is accorded than somebody who may economically actually make less money than him because he doesn't speak in exactly the manner that the media institutions and the financial institutions that he interfaces with on a daily basis actually regard him. And so I think that there is an axis in modern America where if we just divide this based on just wealth, I mean, there's heavy correlations here, but if we just came down to pure wealth, I don't think that we're fully tracking people's sense of how respected they do or don't feel, right? I think that there are many people working in the media industry who aren't particularly like well compensated or well paid, but think of themselves and roughly by the institutions in America are regarded with a greater degree of respect than somebody who might be working in manufacturing industries that are in otherwise declining, but still somebody who's able to live a relatively upper middle class, prosperous life for themselves. I don't think class totally tracks wealth, but that's why I framed it broadly, is the sense that every one of those citizens has that they are regarded as co-equal and equally important and valuable and morally worthy members of that society. I think that is an important metric that matters for a long-term flourishing republic as well. So I would add that to the list. And I think that that goes to a philosophical worldview that is a little bit different than the one you laid out, which is that part of our path to liberation is recognizing that the number of green pieces of paper in your bank account has nothing to do with your moral worth. Right. So part of the whole project of saying that, well, this guy has that many yachts and this guy has a nicer car than I do, or a bigger, nicer house than I do, is also at a certain point stepping back and saying that that isn't what's important, actually. Now, that's different from saying somebody, if you're living in abject poverty, there's only so much freedom you're actually going to have, and that's a different discussion. But I do think that there is a certain affliction in a culture that is strictly addicted to materialism, or in a modern sense, one form of wealth. I mean, a lot of things that many wealthy people would vie for today is, I think today, status is measured closer to the number of social media followers you have than you do by the number of green pieces of paper in your bank account. So my only point right now is this idea of social hierarchy and status is not limited to the axis of wealth. There are other cultural axes that matter too. But whatever the axis is, in a well-functioning, flourishing republic, it's one in which the fellow citizens in that republic truly view themselves as morally equivalent in their worth, even though they may be non-equal and unequal in other less important axes that just don't matter as much, whether it's the number of green pieces of paper and the number of social media followers you have, or the way, or the kind of car that you drive. Those are details compared to the inherent moral civic worth of a human being. We can come back to that philosophical discussion, but I think that's actually part of what we're missing, is reviving that sense of mutual respect, regardless of the material manifestations of our equality.
I think that's super interesting, and we will certainly get to the policies because I definitely want to answer that, but I want to press into this idea.
I'd rather stay here, actually. You want to go to policies, we can go there, but the policies follow from this, because this is a different worldview that I think we're missing, and I think it's part of why you saw Donald Trump succeed the way that he did in 2016 is he gave air to that. And since you have a lot of elite men, I lived in Manhattan at the time, but like sort of Manhattan wealthy, classical liberal types that didn't understand, why do you have this Manhattan billionaire who's got his name written on gold in front of his buildings and fly around in a private plane being supported by the everyman who's supporting him, not realizing that he's not one of them. And that's a worldview that's really confined to seeing class exclusively in the form of wealth. I mean, Trump was never really part of the same Harvard-educated hedge fund class that otherwise populated the New York intelligentsia anyway. And so at every level, even at the highest levels of wealth to everywhere across the wealth spectrum, there is this rift in broader division between the question of class and the question of wealth. But on either axis, we've actually lost that sense of reviving co-equal respect to citizens. And I think you see a lot of this on the left, too. I think there's a lot of people in minority communities. I think there's a sense of this grounded historically in some truth. In Black America, feeling a sense of disregard as a person, as a human being, that even after you've achieved some level of economic success or prosperity, that you are still regarded as something other than a full citizen. Certainly for much of our history, I reject that that's true today, but that's beside the point for right now. Are there points in our history where that's absolutely been true? Absolutely, it's been. And so I think we miss the total picture unless we get to that sense of civic equality and that sense that every citizen has a sense and a true sense that they really are co-equal, regardless of material attributes in their lives, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their political views, regardless of whether they know how to refer to somebody by the right pronouns, regardless of whether they capitalize the B in black when they're writing something, regardless of whether or not they adopt the modern politically correct lingo that changes by the week, to say that, no, just because you don't speak in a certain manner or just because you're not part of that particular club, you're still a co-equal citizen and you're regarded as equal. That I think is foundational, and I think it's part of what we're missing. And once we revive that, the rest actually becomes a lot easier. I think that's what we as human beings crave most, is a sense of respect and dignity for who we are. Yes, the autonomy that comes with that, but also the regard, the sense of regard of how you're seen by your fellow, not animals. You don't care how a dog looks at you. You don't care how a cow looks at you, but you care about how your fellow human beings look at you. And that's not wrong. It's part of being human, is that we care about the way that we're regarded by others. That's what we've lost right now.
How do we revive it?
Well, yes. So that's a deeper question. I think that being able to talk about it in the open is part of what we revive. Part of the reason we've lost it is one of the things that gives us equal regard for one another as human beings is our ability to engage in open, respectful, but unfiltered conversation with one another. I think part of what's fostered, and it's been like kerosene that we've thrown on this fire, is this culture of fear that has suppressed that dialogue, right? I think that one metric for how well we're doing, you could put this on the list of metrics too, is what is the gap between what people are willing to say in public and what they're willing to say in private? That's an interesting metric. Right now, I think that gap, certainly for the last 5 years, that gap has been pretty wide. Right? The percentage of people who are willing to say what they actually think in public. I think that we're doing relatively poorly over the last 5 years compared to other points in our history where we've maybe done better as a country. I think that's a metric that matters too. It's also a proxy for the sense of mutual self-regard, because if you're willing to say something at the dinner table, but you're not willing to say it in public, that means that A, you're worried about how you'll be regarded by others if you say it. B, it means you don't even regard your fellow human being as with enough respect to say that he gets to hear what I have to say. So those metrics matter too. That goes to that sense of civic respect. How do you fix it? Well, part of that is some of the policies that have created that suppression of speech, right? You'd have your social media account locked if you happen to say that COVID-19 began in a lab in China, or that, you could go straight down the list that could become political quickly. But the Hunter Biden laptop story being suppressed on the eve of the last election, if you said that that was a real story, you would have had your social media account locked. Well, we could talk about all of the First Amendment violations at issue there, and I've gone at length on that, and we can go there. But I'm making a different point now, which is that degrades our sense of co-equal respect for one another as citizens, where if you have certain opinions and you're not allowed to express them, but I have certain opinions on those matters and I am allowed to express them, that's a sense in which we literally feel grounded in truth that we're not in any sense equal as citizens in that society. Versus bring back that civic equality. Right? That idea. And I think service in the military is one of the things that does that, by the way. It's not the only thing that does that. But serving shoulder to shoulder for somebody who might be a kid of a billionaire from the Upper East Side of Manhattan to somebody who grew up in a single family on the South Side of Chicago, it doesn't matter. You are both there serving a common cause. Doesn't matter when you're in a classroom or on a social media site together, able to each express your own opinion. That's what matters, is that you're co-equal citizens. Now, is somebody going to be better at one thing than the other thing, and somebody going to have different types of, one person's going to have more social media followers, and the other person's going to have more dollars in their bank account, and the other guy's going to have a different kind of car, and the other guy's going to have a different kind of house? Sure, but those are details, and they don't matter as much against the backdrop of that civic equality. Then you get to the sense of, okay, are you getting too philosophical and somebody doesn't have enough food to put on the dinner table? Are you telling me they really are going to be co-equal just because they're regarded as such? Well, then it tells us what's the scope of the problems we need to solve. I do think that somebody should, be able to, through basic hard work, be able to at least provide for their own family if they're doing things the right way. But that reduces the scope of what we're solving for, of making sure that everybody has the basic needs to be treated to just live in a functioning life, right? If you're dying of starvation, the kinds of questions we're talking about are mostly irrelevant. But that reduces the scope of where our policy solutions focus. And I think that we can reduce that scope to solvable problems if we get to the more foundational problem of restoring that civic respect in the first place. And I know it's a different worldview a little bit than we started with. It's a different framework, maybe.
Sure. I'm not yet sure that I see it as a different framing, but
maybe
it
it's
is
not even different.
So insightful. Here's what I'm taking away from that. So you've really made a phenomenally useful point, which is my ultimate barometer, around classism is no longer about just how much money you make. That's really insightful. I really struggled for a long time with the idea of the elites. I didn't understand what people were talking about, the elites. And then it becomes clear when I start thinking about the will to power, the nanny state, where people are like, I need to make decisions for you because you're not going to make good decisions for yourself. And to your point, that could be coming from somebody who's making $32,000, living an artistic life in Brooklyn, whatever.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily have to be tied to how much money they're making. Okay, super, super insightful. Now, though, as we put it into not existing just in the realm of philosophy, but just tactically feet on the ground, how do we make something work? Right. Okay. I'll assume you know nothing about my background. I'll walk you through a really small sliver so you can understand the worldview that I operate under. I try to break into the film industry. This is in the 90s. I have no idea how to do it. YouTube doesn't exist. Cameras are not on cell phones. I realized to control the art, I need to control the money. And so I decided to get into business to get rich. I thought it would take 18 months. It took 15 years, but it actually did work. And I ended up selling a company for $1 billion.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Good for you, man.
Thank you.
Did you own all of it?
I did not, but there was 3 of us. So
okay. Hey, it's pretty good.
I did well. Hey. So then I decide I'm going to start the thing that I came here to do before, which is to build a media company. Now, in the beginning, I just wanted to tell cool stories. I didn't have any compelling reason why I wanted to tell cool stories. But in building my last company, I had 3,000 employees. 1,000 of them grew up hard in the inner cities, like hard. And because we're manufacturing, I'm there in the inner cities with them. And so I'm getting to know them, seeing them up close. I decide I'm animated by the fact that right now in the developed world, the number one predictor of your future success is your zip code, more than your IQ, which if it's your IQ, that's bad enough. But the fact that it's your zip code.
They've separated that? They've controlled for that?
In terms of the data, yeah, correct.
Interesting.
Correct. So looking at that, I was like, okay, this I cannot abide. And so
I actually buy that now that I think about why. Yeah.
It's terrifying.
School systems. Yep.
School systems, a set of ideas. So for instance, just what I mean by ideas, I had one kid who was clearly able to process raw data faster than me. So I'll call that smarter than me. Smarter than me, but he's doing nothing with his life, literally nothing productive. It was absolutely terrifying to see this kid who I'm like, you're frighteningly smart. And yet you're doing nothing. And I was like, why aren't you doing anything? And he said, oh, my mom told me that the world doesn't want people who look like me to be successful. And I was like, wait, what? And so he's like, he'd never thought of it before. But as I'm pushing him, he's like, if that's true though, why would I even try? It doesn't make sense. So I was like, wow, let's just stop. That's the worst advice you've ever received in your entire life. You need to immediately stop and recognize that Kobe Bryant has the right idea, which is you can get so good at something that people can't stop you.
Yeah.
And if you just focus on that, get good at a thing you care about and go execute, and you will be shocked that the world, no matter how much they hate you, even if it's true that they don't want you to succeed just based on the way you look, they can't stop you.
Right.
So I then started this thing I call Quest University. And I'm like, look, I'm going to show up early. I'll stay late. I will teach you everything I know about entrepreneurship. If you want to start a competitive business, I'm here for it. I don't care. I just want you to know I care more about your future than your own mother. And so they started coming in. I'm teaching them all these ideas. I'm like, literally, just think like this, act like this, and you can get the results that I've gotten, because I literally took myself from scrounging in my couch cushions to find enough change to put gas in my car to building at that time had built $1 billion company and not yet sold it. So they all saw like, whoa, like he's really done this. Maybe this stuff will work. Now, here's the sad news. This stuff really does work. I I have built 3 successful companies in 3 wildly divergent industries, just thinking from first principles. Anybody can think from first principles. And still, despite that, despite me teaching them all the things that I did, only 2% of them did anything. And I became wildly disheartened. And I was like, you may disagree, and I would love it if you did, because you'll open new avenues for me. I realized I had to give up on adults. They can change, but they're not going to. And when you look at I may be conflating a couple people. I feel bad. I want to get this guy on the show so badly. A guy named Jeffrey Canada, who I attribute every great thing in education to. Maybe some of this is not him. But anyway, here's the punchline. He grows up in Harlem at the time of the crack epidemic, says, I'm going to send myself to Harvard on a scholarship. I'm going to change the education system. Doesn't. He realizes it's too flawed, too broken. You have to go outside the system. He starts doing these charter schools, and he builds them inside of the same building that failing schools are in, with the same kids chosen completely at random from the same school, puts them through a different curriculum, and all of a sudden these kids just like smash every record everywhere. And he said the whole thing you have to focus on is mothers that are either pregnant or about to become pregnant, and get them to read incessantly to their kids. Because what the real predictor in the inner cities of why these kids fail is the language centers of their brain don't develop, because they don't hear enough words by the time they're 3, and the ratio of positive to negative is the exact inverse of middle income kids. So a middle income kid hears 70% positive words, 30% negative. A low income kid hears 70% negative, 30% positive. And he was like, you just have to get them to hear the raw volume of words that a middle income kid hears, so the language centers develop, and get that ratio positive to negative right. And then obviously he carries them through the school system. But anyway, the point being that if you recognize that the ideas themselves are not enough, but that this really can be turned into effectively a policy, read to your kids. So you need to find a way to incentivize that. Get them in an education system where, I don't know if he'll like this characterization, what he does, but basically you have to be able to fire teachers. This is pure meritocracy. You reward high performance, and you effectively filter out people that are underperforming. You have exceedingly high standards, even of quote unquote poor kids. And you just say, hey, here is the expectation here. Now, I lay all of that out because this is an idea problem. And that's why I say I don't think this is a violation of our framing. You've helped me better understand a piece of the reality that I'm trying to frame. But my whole thesis is simply, this is an idea problem. Humans break along these lines where they tend to like one set of ideas or another. You want dynamic tension. You don't want either side to rule the roost. But if you judge based on a knowable, and I'm going to keep saying KPIs just to get people to understand how specific I mean. I like your general buckets. I think they are awesome. But ultimately, if we're talking at the level of policy, we have to start talking about what is the key performance indicator. I expect graduation levels to be this. I expect the percentage of 8th graders that can read at an 8th grade level to be this. And we either are or are not hitting these. If we are hitting these, we do more of it. If we are not hitting these, we do less. And that level of accountability is completely devoid in our current system. And it feels to me that to really address what you're talking about, to really make everybody feel equal, morally equal, regardless of income, regardless of white collar, blue collar, educated, elite, non-elite, whatever. There's no way to do that at any level other than the family.
Yes.
Like, am I crazy?
I don't think you're crazy at all. I think that, again, what I said earlier is kind of funny is most thinkers over the course of human history who have had conversations like this, Socratic dialogue. You know, the modern podcast is really a resuscitation of Socratic dialogue that existed thousands of years ago, have come to a really similar conclusion. And there's a reason for that, is your need to both be an individual but balanced against being part of a community that is bigger than yourself. There's no better example of that than the family unit. And so the right unit that trains you to exercise both of those muscles is at the level of the family. So no, I don't think that's a crazy thing to say. I think that is, the data also points to the same point. It's actually, I'll tell you the first thing that went through my head as you were just reciting that data. First of all, some of that's really fascinating. My first thought went not even to the level of society, but went to the level of like making sure I'm going home and reading to my kids later today. And that ties into kind of an evolutionarily hardwired impulse anyway that we're able to use to our betterment, which is we care about our own children. We care about our own family members like our own kin. I don't think that that's something that we should hide from. I think that we should be ashamed of. I think we should harness it and use it in our favor. And so, yes, I think that is much closer to whatever the answer is. You're a lot closer to the flame there than you are trying to design some sort of centralized system of command and control using coercion to get there, because that's, I think the data would also show, been a losing battle over the course of the last 60 years in the United States.
Okay, so now to close the loop on the reason that I started this by saying that I went to film school is through that journey of realizing, okay, I have to give up on adults, but that the family is the only punchline. What I realized was I can't control who your family is. I cannot control what zip code you're born into. I can't even control who your friends are. But through the media, I can control what your friends think is cool. Mm-hmm. And because I'm focused personally on 11 to 15-year-olds, it's known as the age of imprinting. The Japanese actually have a word for it. It's called shonen, which translates as the few years. So it's the few years, roughly 11 to 15, where kids push away from their parents, right? They were just mommy and daddy's little boy, girl until that point. And now all of a sudden they become that sort of annoying teenager.
Yeah.
And that is just an arc in human evolution that just is. Kids are going to do that. Now, what they're doing at that moment is drinking of culture. And culture is ultimately the thing that makes humans humans. We can pass all this knowledge on so rapidly in a way that stacks all the generations that came before us. We don't have to relearn everything. And it just rides in the back of culture. But if culture has something broken in it, DEI, now you've got a problem. And if culture thinks things like meritocracy, working hard, training yourself, pushing yourself, getting better, loving other people, seeing everyone as equal, and all of that is cool, now all of a sudden you have a high functioning society. And so the only way that with Tom Bilyeu's skills, I know to make a meaningful contribution to that, and I said that I have a theory on how to impact people at scale, which is why the show is named what it is. It's to tell stories at that age group that will show characters embodying an empowering mindset so that kids just grow up thinking that's cool. Now, you just purchased Buzzfeed, and I have a feeling it's a very similar strategy. You just haven't given up on adults. How close am I?
It's interesting you say that, because I agree with you that changing the country for the better, if it's going to be done in a decentralized way, which is how I think it has to be done in the most important way, is through culture, right? Is through giving people an idea of what they can aspire to. And one of the things that you're doing, frankly, better than I've done it, is I appeal to reason, I appeal to argument, to logic, but I think you're going to actually touch a lot more of the people, especially in the demographic you're targeting, through the power of narrative. Right? Because I think there's something about us as human beings that's wired for narrative, right? Wired for the arc of a story and to be moved to action by that rather than just through argument. And so I agree with you. It's interesting you brought this full circle to some of the activities that I've pursued in the private sector, right? My activist play with Buzzfeed, which is, obviously a media company that I think has lost its way, but even a lot of what else I've done in the private sector, right? I started a company called Strive to compete against BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard. Part of that was not giving up on adults either. It's not teenagers that are allocating their money into ETFs, but everyday citizens to say that you are co-equal. You deserve to know where your own money is being allocated and how it's being voted. Just as a side detour here to give you maybe my background, and then I can answer your question about how I'm using that going forward. I'm an entrepreneur like you. My parents came here with no money 40 years ago. I aspired to achieve success of the kind that Jack Welch had achieved. He was the CEO of GE, where my dad worked. He was, 10 layers down in the organizational chart. and he was facing layoffs while I was in middle school, and that put our family in a, I would say we were never poor, but in a precarious and uncertain economic position where he ended up going to night school for years to be able to have job security. I would go with him to Northern Kentucky Law School, driving from Cincinnati, Ohio on weeknights after he spent a full day at work. Definitely had an impact on my own upbringing and aspirations. But, you know, when I got out of college, so I went to Harvard for college, studied biology, I got into the world of hedge funds and said, you know what? I want to win through the system of American capitalism. That's how I'm going to get ahead is do it the way that the people who had some level of control over my family's life, direct or indirectly, to say that, you know what, maybe I can achieve a similar position of autonomy myself. And so that's what led me on the journey that I've been on. I started a biotech company that started from more my expertise. And that was guided by a sense of wanting to fix an industry that was broken. And I could tell you all about that story. Roivant was the company I founded. But the businesses I've started subsequently, Roivant was not directed at changing societal culture. It was directed at solving a structural problem in the pharmaceutical industry and capturing an inefficiency and making the production of medicines more efficient and bring down, hopefully, the cost of drugs. But that was that goal. It wasn't a cultural change in the country. Pretty much everything I've done through the private sector since then has been directed at impact theory, as you put it, right? Is driving cultural change of a kind that I don't think can actually be done through the government. So I stepped down from my job at Roivant, wrote a couple of books. Nothing like writing that really opens you up to discovering what you're actually passionate about, what you actually believe. If you can't write it down, you probably don't know what you actually believe. I had an English teacher that taught me that in high school, and I think it's true. And so I've written 3 books. I'm working on my 4th now. And what I would tell you about my first book, Woke Inc., is that I agree with about 95% of what's in there. And that's okay. I think that's a good thing, is to say that, you know what, the process of going through not only writing these books, but exchanging ideas with others who have challenged me on them have caused me to either regain conviction of what's in there, or in certain cases to modify what my actual beliefs were when I was challenged about them. When I got back to how am I going to drive change or have an impact, my first impulse was to do it through entrepreneurship. So I started this business Strive that I was referring to earlier, saying that part of where I think many people have their sense of loss of empowerment or loss of feeling like they can do something with their own lives is where their own assets are used in ways that run counter to their own objectives. So many people may not know this, but your own money is invested probably in things like index funds in your 401k account or your investment account. And it turns out as a shareholder, you do have agency in companies. You have the ability to vote your shares, to tell the management of that company that's using your own money how they're paid, how you want them to behave. Is it for the pursuit of maximizing the value of the company, or is it to advance some other separate agenda? But what most people don't know is that that vote is cast by large financial institutions like BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and Invesco and others that for years have been voting your own shares in favor of ideological goals that many Americans don't agree with, but maybe even more importantly, do not have anything to do with advancing your best financial interests, like voting for racial equity audits at Apple or emissions cap programs at Chevron that have nothing to do with their business interests, but they're using your money to advance those values when you may not even agree with those values.
So is Strive a broker that…
So Strive is an alternative financial institution and asset manager that competes against BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard.
And so you guys, do a higher degree of communication with the individual voters so they can cast their own vote?
Well, offers a choice to the citizen to say, okay, you have all the financial institutions have gone in that direction for one reason. And we can go into that because CalPERS and the California pension funds are forcing those institutions to behave that way. We'd say we're not catering to large politicized financial institutions. We're catering to the everyday individual by saying that this index fund or set of index funds offers one goal: what maximizes your profit? What actually maximizes the performance of the company? That's the sole goal. The goal is not to solve climate change. The goal is not to solve racial inequality. The goal is not to advance any other social agenda. If you wish to do that with your own dollars philanthropically, but you're not going to do it through BlackRock or State Street. You're not doing that via Strive. And if that's your goal, Strive isn't for you. But for the Americans who want exclusively to maximize profit and to vote their shares and to speak on behalf of their own financial holdings accordingly, this is an option that didn't exist that does exist today. But, I could go on about Strive for a while, but that gives you a sense of how do I want to drive change? That was not through the government. That was driving change through providing a sense of empowerment to the everyday citizen through an economic option in the marketplace.
I love that. And I'm shocked at how few people know about the way that this kind of thing works.
Yeah.
That's amazing. The move, though, that I think has really captured everybody's imagination is Buzzfeed.
Much more recent.
For sure. Yeah,
After I ran for president,
it's not just that it's recent.
Yeah.
It's that, so for any of us that have been paying attention to what you've been saying for a while now, it's like, hey, I'm going to do whatever I think has the most impact on the country, most positive impact on the country. Cut to announced that I'm out of the race. Oh, P.S. Since January, I've been buying up shares in Buzzfeed, media company. Also, again, putting it together with one of the things you've said is you really think that the way the media frames the issues is creating the divisiveness that they then frame as being divisive. And so they've created this positive feedback loop of talking about division, which is creating division, which lets them talk about division, which creates more division. And so to see you step into that is certainly interesting. So I would now fully understanding what you're doing with Strive. Help me understand what's the goal with Buzzfeed. And, and is Buzzfeed in a way going to be like your mini America where we come in with the chainsaw, we're trying to obliterate this down, build it back up with a zero budget mentality. And can we take away from what you're doing or going to do with Buzzfeed, how you would run the country?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of principles that are in common with the vision that I have for rebuilding a media institution that has lost its way and the way you think about rebuilding a country that has lost its way. You've got a managerial class, right? The hired middle bureaucracy that has betrayed what the original mission of this company was supposed to be. And like so many other media companies, has really lost its way by systematically lying to its audiences. I think it is put left-wing versus right-wing politics to one side. BuzzFeed is a company that literally was the first to publish the now discredited Steele dossier that divided this country for years. It was a company that told falsehoods about the Hunter Biden laptop story that forget about even American politics. Just think about culture. A lot of the falsehoods about, say what you will about the man. Kevin Spacey was acquitted on criminal charges that were initially perpetrated by a takedown that came from none other than BuzzFeed, or a company that has elevated Che Guevara's, I would say, disgusting, ugly practices and whitewashing that. You could go down the straight list of journalistic failures across the board, and it came from an institution that on one hand preaches diversity of thought, right? They mandate diversity and inclusion and belonging trainings in the name of fostering diversity of thought, which I think is critical for a media institution to actually care about diversity of thought and competition in the marketplace of ideas. And yet, one of the pieces of public data you can look at as an investor is what percentage of your employees' political contributions go in one direction or another. And it's not 50-50, and I don't think you would expect that for a media institution based in New York. But you look at the political giving history of BuzzFeed's employee base. You and I were talking about this just off air before the show. Over 99% of BuzzFeed's employee contributions since 2010 have not been to Republicans, but have gone the other way. And so that, I think, is in some ways a mirage. It's a joke, right? So it's not an accident that the same institution that has repeatedly failed in its journalistic failures and that has lost the trust of its own audience base and that has failed as a business that's down precipitously since it went public. It's not an accident that that's the same business that totally lacked diversity of thought in its ranks. Those two things go together. And a big part of the reason why is you have this managerial class that even for a business that's still making money on its top line is losing money on its bottom line that doesn't have to be because of the bloat and the sense of entitlement and the sense of loss of touch with its own purpose and mission has caused it to lose its way as a business in the same way that it's lost its way as an institution that stands for its own values of diversity of thought. So sometimes it takes somebody coming in from the outside to do things differently, right? This is a company that was founded nearly 20 years ago, and it's went public for $1.5 billion. At the time I started first buying shares, it had a market cap of less than $50 million. It has really lost its way. evidenced and you want to look at KPIs, you can take a lot of the soft factors that I'm offering, but the public markets ultimately delivered the verdict. And so one of the things I'm looking at is how do I drive change through the private sector? The media is one of the institutions that the government is not going to be the one to change and should not be the one to change, but is going to come through private market change itself. And so, yes, I believe that even taking some of my experiences from Strive, using the voice of shareholders, now doing it in my capacity as an individual to change this company bottom up, that's something that I decided was worthwhile. I had the financial means to do it. I have a clear vision for where the company needs to go, which is, number one, admit your prior mistakes. Number two, clean house. A lot of that excess spend as a financial matter, if you gut that just like I would do in the administrative state and the federal government, it leaves more money for your actual stakeholders. In the case of a company, that's your shareholders. In the case of a country, that's your citizens. But it also gets a lot of that historical, ossified, biased way of thinking out of the system and allows this company to think like what it is, which is admit you're a startup, embrace that again, start with a blank slate and say, what's a business model that better fosters that vision of pursuing truth? Now, one of the business strategy shifts that I believe the company needs to take, and if I have influence on it, I'll be directing exactly to do this, is more decentralized audiovisual content creation. I mean, the trust right now of consumers isn't with a centralized corporate brand. It's with individual content creators. Embrace some of those same principles of individual capitalism and individualism to say that, you know what, operate it like what in the financial world you call a multi-manager platform. Hedge funds like Millennium have operated this way, where you give, like to a portfolio manager, you get a percentage of what you make. Do that for all your content creators. Don't just pay them as hired hands. Give them upside in what they generate. And a company like Buzzfeed isn't starting from scratch. It's got hundreds of millions of social media followers, 90 or 70 plus million, whatever the number is, 60 to 70 million YouTube subscribers, but hundreds of millions across social media channels. It's got the pipes. They're failing to produce the fluid, but part of the reason why is they've got this managerial class at the company that has sucked the lifeblood out of its profitability, but have also sucked the lifeblood out of its way of thinking independently as an organization. I say gut that, decentralize it, give people skin in the game in what they generate, and then build what a company like that lacks today, which is a brand. And I think that brand can be in pursuit of truth. No more lies. We're done with it. And do something that no major media institution, and by the way, I would say the same could apply to a government, but I'm talking about the media right now, look its own audience in the eye and say, we lied to you. We're sorry. We cannot excuse the mistakes we made in the past, but unlike every other media institution that's unwilling to do it, we're going to admit it. We're going to lay out, here's how we're going to make sure that never happens again. Don't trust us. Trust our talents. Don't trust any one of them. We're going to have platform voices who are diverse across the ideological and cultural spectrum, but that we believe that we get to truth through the open exchange of ideas, through open dialogue. That's what we're actually going to foster at a high degree of quality, not just like a social media platform where it's a free-for-all, and that should exist. That's different. But as a publisher, where you say that, you know what, we're going to filter for quality. That's part of our job to deliver you is high quality. But it's not our job to ideologically tell you how to think. Rather, you get to actually come to a place where you hear diverse voices across the ideological and cultural spectrum on matters relating to politics, to culture, to finance, to lifestyle, to sports. And I think that's an inspiring vision that doesn't exist in the media landscape today that customers are hungering for, but also has an effect of restoring that sense of civic equality to say that, you know what, just because my views are different than yours, that doesn't mean that I am lesser than you. That, you know what, I'm going to worry less about how my leadership looks, whether they look like the rest of America, which is what they, like most corporate boards, are worried about, and worried more about whether they think like the rest of America, the full distribution of how people think in America. And I think that could be the backbone of building a great media institution, a great media company in the next generation. They're not doing it. And you have an ability to save something. And by the way, that particular company right now, they don't have a lot of choice in the matter, right? So I took a stake in, I've taken a stake in the company. As I said, I continue to accumulate in that stake. Now, they have this founder who founded the company as the CEO who supposedly has super majority voting rights. And people say, oh, well, how are you going to drive change? The company has a clock that's ticking. They have debt that comes due this December. So you know who really holds the rights over the company is the people who are going to be able to call that debt in December of this year, which actually I think creates an interesting dynamic where in a situation like this for years, you've had no discipline brought to the managerial class or the management of that company. In the year 2024, there are going to have to be some hard decisions that are made. And yes, now I'm one of the parties at the table that is going to, I'm the second largest Class A shareholder of the company. I did it not with a passive intention, but with an activist intention to try to put my money where my mouth is and actually drive change through culture, especially with actually even a younger audience and demographic that is hungry for a different vision of what a media company can be, a different vision of what leadership and cultural leadership looks like to them. And so, you know, I do hope to succeed in being able to deliver that and make this an incredibly successful company in the process. But that is contingent on my actually gaining control.
Speaking of gaining control, so having watched Elon Musk do something very similar with Twitter, now X, one of the big confrontations was with Agarwal. I forget his first name, but
Parag Agarwal. Yep,
Parag. They, I think, knew, given the contentious way that they bumped him out of the company, they were not going to make progress if that leadership was still in place. Now, given the responses that the CEO has given to to the letter that you wrote to shareholders, very specifically, you saying, hey, the first people that go out and apologize for misleading, misrepresenting, lying to the public, they're going to have a real shot. And there seems to be a sense in culture that you're very right about that, and that we're all hungering for somebody who's going to plant a flag and say, this is the brand.
Yes.
Like, we're in pursuit of truth. But he said, and I'm pretty sure this is very close to a quote, we will not be apologizing for our Pulitzer Prize winning journalism.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that? Are you just going to make moves to get him out? Like, do you really think you can have a philosophical conversion? That seems
I don't think at the
hyper-unlikely.
CEO level we would be possible to have a philosophical conversion. If this was any other business that wasn't a media company operating in its own echo chamber and set up the way that this was with the voting rights for this founder, this guy would be out long ago. And the level of, you know, I think that it's interesting. Sometimes you have people who are incredibly successful in the outcomes they've delivered, said they're going to do something, go out and achieve it, create something of value, yet they still are really humble. I would characterize what I see from this CEO as the exact inverse of that. A guy who sold the dream, went public for $1.5 billion, tanked in the toilet. As I said, it was less than a $50 million market cap or so when I was started to become an owner. It's still about barely over $100 million market cap company now, as of us having this conversation right now. And yet this is a guy who has the hubris of somehow believing that he was a success, so much so that he actually can't contend with the admission of prior failure. And so, you know, when you become part of that managerial class, whether it's in the bureaucracy in the federal government or the equivalent of what I call deep corporate, which exists in the private sector, and people talk about the deep state. Well, deep corporate is an outgrowth of that too. You go beyond the point of individual repair. So I haven't met with him yet, as of at least our having this conversation. I'm sure in short order I will. But based on what I see, I think that what I will say is that if this were any other company, there's no way this guy would be the CEO or given the keys to come anywhere near spitting distance of where decisions are actually made. And yet there hasn't been an iota of accountability or an iota of self-reflection to look their own audiences or their own shareholders, for that matter, in the eye when the results on both counts speak for themselves. Some of the greatest lies that have been debunked coming out of that organization, stock price that has been in the toilet relative to what his own shareholder base bet on at the time that they went public, I think both deserve accountability. And I think that it's going to take people who are willing to put their money where their mouth is to deliver that. And I think that now it was a pretty interesting moment for me to get involved. I think that Buzzfeed still could become a company more valuable than at the time of its initial listing. I believe that, but that's going to require a massive change in strategy to pull off. And what I laid out in my shareholder letter, I stand by it to the fullest, is that with a true hardcore financial cleanup of the house, not catching the falling knife, makeover type stuff, but really gutting much of that cost base, and not just the cost base, but the bureaucratic mindset that infiltrates that cost base. Gut that, get rid of it. Start with an actual whiteboard as a startup, a lean, mean startup. Embrace actual decentralized content creation and a business model that is lower capital expenditure intensive, but is also more creative in allowing content creators to share in the upside. Do it across the political and cultural spectrum to embrace actual diversity of thought, and then make that your brand. Say we embrace diversity of thought and we stand for no more lies. We stand for the pursuit of truth, and we do that through the exchange of ideas. That's powerful stuff. That's the stuff our country was founded on. It's the stuff that a great media company can be built on the back of those bones. No other media company is doing it today. And the fact that they're starting at such a low base, even as of when we're having this conversation, you know, relatively still a small cap company, a little over $100 million in market cap, that's an opportunity to really demonstrate a turnaround story for the ages. That is possible. But I think if you have a guy at the top who has no interest in either fulfilling his obligation to his shareholders or to his audiences, is change going to be required for that managerial class to pull this off? Probably. And then you get into tactics, right? Which is, well, if the founder has super voting control of the shares, how could an outside shareholder with Class A shares do it? Well, for better or worse, the company has a big financial problem right now, because its alternative right now is there's also a real risk of bankruptcy. There's a real risk of bankruptcy this year in December when they have their debt that comes due. It's a company that has more debt than cash on its balance sheet. Now, that's a risk factor. There's a risk factor in every investment. That's a big risk factor for me in this investment. But I also think that could be the catalyst to drive the kind of change that otherwise wouldn't have happened in somebody who's living in their own insular vision of the world, the old story of the frog in the well that isn't able to see outside the well because the frog lives inside the well. That's effectively what I see with the management of Buzzfeed today.
Mm. Okay, so what do you say to somebody who hears the story of a guy that his own dad was at risk of getting laid off at GE,
yep,
and now is coming in and uses words like, I'm going to gut the place. Those are real people that are really going to lose jobs. They have families.
Yeah.
What's your response to people who just think that's icky and they don't like anything about it?
Well, first of all, I think that let's just talk about that spectrum earlier where you talk about the cultural elite in this country, or the people who have been at the top of a self-proclaimed top of a cultural totem pole. A lot of these employees at BuzzFeed fit the exact description of what we were talking about earlier. Class does not necessarily track wealth. So we're not talking about here going after people who haven't been propped up in the cultural hierarchy of the United States, a reverse vision of actual intersectionality. It's kind of an interesting dynamic here. Now, are a lot of those going to be good people? Absolutely. Many of them, many former employees, I've been struck by this since the time that my stake in BuzzFeed was disclosed, have reached out to me. Many people who I presume, at least based on what they said, probably have different political views than I do, but who are deeply frustrated with an institution that's lost its way. Mm. And just as I don't think it's the job of the federal government to provide employment opportunity to bureaucrats, I don't. I think the job of the federal government is to serve its citizens. The job of a media company is to serve its audiences and to create value in the process. And so should we have a society in which we're able to give each of those persons as citizens the opportunity to flourish in that country? Yes, we should. But if somebody was hired in the backdrop of saying that, you know what, I get to work here and in the name of preaching diversity, I'm going to actually create a culture of exclusion where anybody who has a different point of view than mine isn't welcome, that my company's gone down the toilet as a result, shareholders have lost hundreds of millions of dollars as a result, and that I somehow just get to continue collecting a paycheck from the debt holders who are subsidizing me for the next 12 months. No, I don't think that that's the right answer to that question. And by the way, in this particular case, that's where this is heading anyway. If the company goes bankrupt, right? If a company has more debt than cash and it is losing money on a shrinking revenue base, that's where this story ends anyway. Versus proactively with an actual vision and a strategy, you're able to revitalize that institution. Which is the better of those two choices? I think the answer is clear.
All right, you've been through a political ringer that I can't imagine, nor do I ever want to have anything to do with. But I'm very curious. So there's a reason, because I can't imagine that you don't see what I'm about to say. Okay. But there's maybe a very good reason that you never say it. So I'm going to say it and then tell me if I'm out of my mind and I'm really just blind to a reality that I need to wake up to. I look at a company and I say, okay, I take very seriously the fact that if I make poor decisions, the people that are helping me build this company they're going to have to find an alternative way to feed their family, and that will be a very disruptive moment for them. So I think tremendously about, I have an obligation to the people that work in my company. However, as I tell them, this is not a family. We are a team. And our job is to win a championship. And just like on a championship sports team, if I have somebody that's underperforming at their role, I am going to find somebody that can perform in that role to the level of excellence that we need to win a championship. And that doesn't mean I don't love and care about you. And it certainly doesn't mean that you're not morally equal to me and anybody else. I wish you the best. But the reality is that my obligation is to building an organism that's going to win a championship. And the great irony, as I am a huge individualist, the great irony is I think the individual is important for the safety of the whole, out in real life, just like man on the street, as well as in a company. And so the reason that I really want people to be strong individually is the way that we win as an organism is by being just ultra good at what we do, quote unquote. Now, so far at the human level, that's been taming the planet. We've done a phenomenal job of making this a safe place to be, elongating lifespan, all of that. But at the company level, 100% with no malice nor remorse, I'm going to say you're underperforming. I'm going to tell you what good performance looks like. If you don't meet good performance and we try to help you and you still can't do it, we are going to cut you. And for the health of the organism, sometimes you have to cut off an underperforming individual. Mm-hmm. And I think people they're not willing to face that truth. And because they're not willing to face that truth, we get into this derangement where somebody gives the bumper sticker of nobody should be left behind. And because my bumper sticker is underperformers are going to be set free to find a better performance, which is the right way to think about it. But that bumper sticker, people don't like that.
Well, I don't know that people don't like that. I want to give you a lot of credit for the way you framed that, because I think that it was honest. I find it inspiring, right? As if I was working at your company, I think that's a great message, is that you as a leader hold yourself accountable to the people who have taken the risk of following you and their families along with them. But that your obligation to them and to that entire team is to deliver a championship victory. And just because somebody isn't in the right place, if they're not contributing to that championship victory here, they could be contributing to a championship victory somewhere else. And so I think it's part of the dignity of each person. You're not doing them a service if they're not set up to succeed in the role where you've put them. That's your failure or my failure as a leader if we actually do that. So do people disagree with that? I don't know. I mean, of course, some people will disagree with that, but it doesn't really make sense. And just because someone disagrees with something doesn't mean they're right. They have the right to hold their own opinion, but they don't have the right to continue occupying a seat on a team where they're pulling down the other people on that team. No one left behind. Well, you know, the entire team gets left behind as a consequence. And so I agree with that principle that we don't want no American left behind. I can get behind that. That's an America First principle right there. But no American left behind doesn't mean that you put them in a position where they are failing both for themselves and for the broader organism. I think that we have to have a system in which they have the ability to find where they're able to maximize their own innate God-given talents. And I think that that's part of what our country demands and require. We're not doing that today, both because of government action and also because of leaders of companies, you know, not like yours, but maybe companies like Buzzfeed that are doing a horrific job of actually putting the best person on the job, maybe even in that case, starting at the very top. I think that we need institutions that revive merit again in this country, that if you're the best person for the job, you get it, period. And if not, we respect you and we're going to set you free to be able to find what that best job is, even if it's not at this particular company or this particular organization. That's fundamentally American to me, and I think it actually revives a sense of respect that we're missing, as opposed to quietly keeping somebody who's an underperformer in that job. What you actually foster is a greater sense of hostility, suppressed hostility, a greater sense of condescension. Other members of that team who aren't able to actually do what they need to do for their families because somebody else is holding back the team that's no longer winning that championship as a result. So my only feedback to you is I love the way you laid that out. Don't hedge, don't apologize for it. And I think that you're going to find a lot more people who are inspired by that than people who aren't. And for the few who aren't, I do think that they still will be in a better position to do what's best for them as a result of you giving them the ability to do that.
Much to my dismay, much to my team's dismay, I should say, I don't hedge at all. I wrote a document, our culture document, that everybody has to read before they can even interview at the company, which outlines in far more aggressive language than I just laid it out there, what we're looking for, that we're here to win a championship, and that I'm only interested in people that want that. And I've been asked repeatedly by our HR team to stop making people read that so early in the thing. Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
Trust me on this. I am unfazed, and I am unfazed because I believe in KPIs. And so I totally understand that people want to hear language about you're going to be protected. Don't worry, you can never lose your job. But as an incentive structure, that does not incentivize people to do their best. Like they need to understand, hey, you're here to serve the organism. We have an honorable goal, so you can be excited about that. We have an honorable goal. We are here to uplift people's lives and to make their lives better. However, I'm expecting the hardest core motherfuckers on planet Earth. If you ask in the interview process about work-life balance, I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's not the right thing.
Yeah, it's not the right fit. Yeah, exactly.
You are not going to like working at Impact Theory. That's just true. Now, if I didn't feel like 80% of people opt out just reading that document, then I'd be like, we're not in a weird place.
Yeah.
But my whole, totally anecdotal, but my whole thing is when I look out at the world and I see the advice I'll give to people on social media and the things that people respond extremely negatively to, when I see the number of people that respond negatively to that culture document, it does start to feel like right now, the ideas that people have adopted from a value system perspective are out of alignment with what it takes to win a championship. And so when I think about even what you're doing at Buzzfeed, or certainly, man, if you get into the White House, it's like, how do we begin to get people excited about the Kobe Bryants of the world who worked themselves to a level of success that now is like, it's a little bit frowned upon from hustle culture and that kind of thing.
So I want to say a side point about the NBA point, because you brought this up twice. A lot of people don't know this, and I just thought it'd be an interesting fact to share. You brought up Kobe Bryant, who I loved and respected and admired as well. It surprised a lot of people to know about NBA players. Most of them actually came from stable two-parent households and middle-class backgrounds. It's actually really interesting. I'm writing a book right now called Truths. One of the chapters is about the nuclear family, and in my research on that, turns out that even surprises people, where you kind of have this mental model. It's actually a wrong mental model. It's a wrong preconceived notion. Just smoke out part of the reason why. I think most NBA players today still are Black. There's a historical association with Black family formation being worse than other races, which is true. About 40% of Black kids, plus 40+% of Black kids today are still born in single parent households. But if you take a look at people who are succeeding at the highest level that many kids aspire to when they're young, and has great cultural respect as well as financial respect in our country, which is becoming a professional NBA player, including the likes of Kobe Bryant, they came from actually very solid family backgrounds that predicted for their own success. So that's an interesting little story of how we get back there. I think a lot of the answers still point back to both family formation as well as how we, in the way that you're doing at Impact Theory, acculturate people beginning at even a really young age. Now, some of this I think can also come from the cultural tone that you set as a U.S. president, or from the top as well. It's part of what drew me to be president. Is half the job, I think, is policy, for sure. And we spend a lot of time. We spend like 90% of the time running for president talking about policy. But half the job has nothing to do with policy and the tone you set for our national character of who we actually are. And part of what we're missing in the country today is people have lost their sense of pride in being an American. People have lost their sense of even knowing what it means to be an American. And so I think if we brought that culture back, having somebody in the same way that you as a CEO set the tone for your culture document at your company, and I'm big on believing these things. My first company, Roivant, we actually had a thing where you could opt out after 2 months on the job and get a really nice exit package. And you just say, I'm opting out, or at month 2, you have to sign officially that I am opting in, that having seen what I see, which is a definitely hard charging, run through walls culture, certainly in the early days of the company, that's what you're actually opting into and giving up a financial benefit that would be a great exit package to do it. So for the level of companies, I believe that. But imagine if we adopted a similar vision at the level of our nation to say that, this is a national leader who repeatedly reminds us who we actually are as Americans. That's what George Washington did. That was the most important thing he did as the first president. It wasn't any policy adopted, but his statement of vision of who we actually are as a nation. What are the national values that we embrace? Who are we? We are exceptional. We are the people who actually are the winners, both on a global stage and at the level of an individual. We don't make you apologize for success. We believe, to borrow Martin Luther King's words, that you get ahead not on the color of your skin, but on the content of your character, and that you're free to speak your mind. Even if I disagree with you, I will fight to the death for your right to say it, and we will excel both as individuals and as a nation as a whole and be proud of it rather than hiding success. I think that has a trickle-down effect for our culture too. So the short answer to your question is I don't think it's going to be some silver bullet panacea. I think it's going to be all of the above. People like you stepping up, driving change through our culture, through the power of narratives, showing young people what's possible, giving them an alternative vision and an alternative mental model, not just doing what many commentators do is criticize that culture, but offer an affirmative alternative vision of what that culture can be. Parents who step up to the plate and say, you know what, I am going to acknowledge that the most important job that I may ever have is actually raising and inculcating my children with the right vision of who they can become. A president who says my job isn't just to enact policies, but my job to stand for the national values of who we are and recognize that through my every action, I'm an emblem of our culture as Americans, something that we lack with the guy who's sitting in the White House today, in my opinion. But regardless, I think that that's something that aspires to what George Washington gave us in his first term as first U.S. president. So I think it's going to be all of the above that brings that back. And some of it's going to happen naturally too. It's not going to happen automatically, but I think some of it will actually, the tailwinds will work in our favor, where just like for a company, I think you have this. I think you have this for a country too, or even an individual. You go through these cycles where success breeds entitlement, entitlement breeds laziness, laziness breeds victimhood. And I think that that's where we are right now. But then the victimhood gives you hard consequences that give you hardship that require you to become scrappy again to be able to overcome that hardship. Right. What's the way the old saying go? I'll probably botch it right now, but hard times create strong men create easy times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Right. There's a certain cycle of history. It was a quote that's often wrongly attributed to the founder of Dubai. I think it was an American who American novelist who ended up writing it, but it was the story of, as though it was attributed to the founder of Dubai. My grandfather rode a camel. My father rode a camel. I ride a Land Rover. My son rides a Mercedes. My grandson will ride a Mercedes, but my great-grandson will ride a camel again. And so in a certain sense, even if you study the Roman Empire, there wasn't one rise and one fall of ancient Rome. There were many rises and there were many falls. And I think so it will be. So it has been, and so it will be with our American culture as well. I don't think this has to be the final fall. Now, if you never get past that cycle of recovery, there is one time where it is the final fall. I don't think this has to be the one. But some of this is just the natural course of history of success, the success breeding entitlement, entitlement breeding laziness, laziness breeding victimhood cycle. But we're only going to get out of that cycle if leaders in different spheres of our culture step up, from entrepreneurs to parents to presidents. And I think that we're in a moment where we could use people in each of those roles stepping up to fill that vacuum. I tried to do it as the president. Most people didn't know who I was a year ago. And so that made that journey get about as far as it did last time around. But now I'm trying to do it as an entrepreneur. And, people ask me, what are your plans for the future? Forget about the distant future. Figure out what you're going to do right now. After I left the race, I started acquiring shares in Buzzfeed. And that's not the only thing I'm doing, by the way. There's going to be some other things that I hope to do that are substantial in driving change through the private sector too, that may reveal themselves later this year. I'm going to continue through hopefully cultivating Strive and the management team I've built there to drive change through the financial markets and empowering Americans who have a greater sense of revival and purpose and empowerment because their money isn't being exploited back against them through an expansion of Strive that hopefully we implement later this year.
You've also been helping Trump get elected.
Yes.
Why is he the right president at this tumultuous moment? Why him?
Well, look, I endorsed him wholeheartedly after I left the race. I ran for president against him, right, for the entirety of last year. But having been clear at the end of the Iowa caucus, I got about 8% of the vote. I was going to get about 8% in New Hampshire. It was critical, in my view, that we had a decisive outcome coming out of New Hampshire where that primary didn't get prolonged longer than it needed to be. So I wanted to throw my 8%, small though that was in absolute numbers, in Trump's direction to be able to really deliver a decisive end. And, you know, I'm grateful to learn a million things through the process. I can tell you about my own journey of running for president. But the reason I endorsed Trump is a really clear reason is you have a rare opportunity in American history to put someone back in the job who delivered results in the time that he was there. You don't have to make this philosophical. You could say you got 4 years of Trump, you got 4 years of Biden. Here you have a guy who, forget all the talk that a presidential candidate might offer of what they're going to do. He kept us out of war. He grew the economy. And I think he did start to rebuild that sense of American pride that we're now lacking and have gone back to lacking in this country. So yes, do I want to stay out of wars? Do I want to grow this economy? Do I want to fix the immigration problem in this country, which is something that I'm particularly passionate about, and revive our sense of identity and pride? I do think that he's going to be the best person to deliver that. And my job as a not only former presidential candidate now, but as a citizen, is to do everything I can to make a sacrifice needed to put the best person I possibly can in that job and to do my part to do it. And so that's why I've been also spending a lot of my time doing what we can to make sure that not only is Donald Trump elected, but the people who are going to be able to implement that vision into reality through congressional races in the Senate, even at the state level. If this is done right, a lot of these policies shouldn't be driven by the federal government, but should be driven by state and local governments, which is why I'm endorsing state and local candidates across this country as well to drive that change. That's part of me doing what I would ask everybody else to do, which is look yourself in the mirror, ask yourself how you're going to use your own skill set and your own capabilities and what this country's given you to save this country. And for me, some of that's going to come through the private sector and some of that is going to come through politics. And for the rest of this year, I'm pedal to the metal on both.
There's one thing with the Trump candidacy, even if people are able to all universally, they won't, of course, but even if they did all universally step back and say, I was better under Trump than I am under Biden, there's something about the way people respond to him that creates this hyper division to a point where the division itself becomes worthy of trepidation. And so while I get it, he's his own man and he's not necessarily going to listen to you, but if he were, like, how would you help him metabolize the need to reach people that right now legitimately believe, hey, you are a threat to democracy. You just absolutely cannot be brought into this tent. Like, how do we find a way to lower his divisiveness?
So here's how I look at it. National unity is a worthy goal, to say the least. And I've gotten to know Donald Trump, both over the last several years, but particularly over the last 4 to 5 months. I know that he cares deeply about national unity. And so my advice to him would be just to tell people that. I know you care about uniting this country. Say so. Let people know what's actually in your heart. He wants America first is a vision that actually goes beyond traditional Republican versus Democrat boundaries. I mean, Donald Trump was a guy who actually back in 2016 changed even the Republican Party's posture towards our war in Iraq and how we remember it, that it was a mistake. And that's a view I happen to share. So he's a guy who has already put pressure on those traditional partisan boundaries. He cares about national unity. Tell the people how much you do care about it. And that alone, I think, will have a hugely positive impact in reuniting this country. And if you listen to the messaging in recent months, I think he's done a great job of going in that direction. Success will be our vengeance. We're going to have our vengeance. He said this in recent months multiple times. And you know, I'm grateful for the ability to spend more time with President Trump after I dropped out of the race in January. But listen to a lot of his a lot of his messages in recent months. I think it's an inspiring message. You know what's going to be our vengeance? Success will be our vengeance. He didn't say that in 2016. He's saying that today.
Yes.
He didn't say that during his presidency. He's saying that today.
Take a look. That one's going to be easy to misread, though. And so my thing is, but
even if I give you a couple other examples,
please,
even in recent weeks of showing up in the Bronx. Right, that's not a place where traditional Republican presidential candidates go. I went to the south side of Chicago and Kensington during my presidential campaign. I called on the entire other Republican Party and the Republican field on the debate stage to do the same thing. None of them did. None of them talked to oppositional media. None of them talked to actual communities that would disagree with them. There were people in the south side of Chicago. Somebody asked me a question. She disagreed with me about racial reparations. She turned around and walked straight out. People were booing me in my face until we got to common ground issues like sealing the border, protecting people in that community, not forking over more money to Ukraine and other foreign wars that could be better utilized in the United States. And we actually found common ground. The only Republican who actually stepped up now and has done that at an even larger scale is Donald Trump going to the South Bronx. He and I were the only Republican candidates who just spoke at the Libertarian Convention. Think about that. President Biden was invited. He didn't show up. But these are people who are a separate third party. It's on the ballot in every state. There's libertarians across this country. Some lean left or right on conventional terms, but it's a different party. To show up at the convention of a different political party and to deliver a speech. So I think many Republicans failed this test abysmally. Donald Trump in 2016 did it, and I think it's a great strategy. I tried to do it in my campaign as well. Show up on the other side's turf. Go to left-wing media. You may not agree with them, but demonstrate that you care about open dialogue by practicing what you preach. And so I think he has actually gone in that direction admirably. And I do think that Joe Biden, he ran on the promise of uniting the country. If he had kept that promise, we wouldn't be where we are. So I care deeply about national unity.
Yeah. I mean, look, you've got other issues, I think, with Joe Biden in terms of just cognitive decline. That one is scary. Are they going to swap him out at the last minute? I kind of hope so, because anyway.
I think it's likely.
Just to stay on Trump for a second. So I love that he's going into the Bronx. That's amazing. Though I think he knows he's indexing well there. I think it's amazing that he's going to libertarians, but there's also, if libertarians are going to break, my guess is that they would break right. So again,
although just take a look at do you watch the video footage there?
I haven't. Let's assume that it's amazing.
It was hostile. I mean, I'm saying you've got a president of the United States where people are actively jeering and booing, and he's still there talking to them and gives another 20-minute speech. Well, Biden was invited to the same place and showed up. I went there too. And an audience
Biden was invited and didn't show up.
Biden was invited and didn't show up in his city. It's in Washington, D.C., less than a mile from where Biden sits. President Trump and I each flew in and gave speeches to an audience that did not agree with 100% of what we said.
Yep.
I did actually a debate with their vice presidential nominee, moderated by not a neutral party, but by a Libertarian Party figure or Libertarian Party. The guy who is idolized by that party, Dave Smith, moderated it. And he's a great guy. But even most people agree with the moderator and the guy debating me on some of the issues more than they do with me. But that's part of what leadership is about, is if you're running to lead a nation, show up and lead that whole nation.
I love all of that.
So I think it's important.
Agreed. The thing I'm getting to, though, is to your earlier point that these lines are breaking actually in a unique way in terms of it isn't just class.
Yeah.
So the group of people that I think are just disproportionately influential that Trump has got to find a way to unite. Otherwise, this just ends up being a bloodbath. Oh, God. I can't believe I even said that.
That's smart.
Oh, yeah. Jesus. Not what I meant at all. For the love of God. But what I'm saying is there's going to be this collision of the elites, especially in media, just going on about that he represents an existential threat to democracy itself.
And those elites in media are so disconnected with where most Americans, regardless of whether they're Democrat or Republican, are. But I think that's going to be an impossible task.
I agree, but is it impossible because of his personality?
No, I think it's impossible because of the rot of those institutions. I mean, this has to do with me doing what I'm doing at Buzzfeed, looking at actually broken media institutions. The people who run those institutions have a vested interest in national division. You use the word bloodbath. I mean, just take actually what Trump referred to was a bloodbath in the auto industry And yet they extrapolated that line to try to convince Americans. Every mainstream publication from the New York Times on down trying to convince Americans that he was talking about a physical bloodbath of Americans here.
I know.
It was just, from Jussie Smollett to COVID origin to the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping plot to, you could go straight down the list, the Nashville transgender shooter manifesto, the Hunter Biden laptop story, the Covington Catholic kids. You go straight down the list. These media failures have intentionally tried to lie and divide the American people. And so are we going to cater to the very people who have perpetrated that division and have benefited from it? Are you ever going to win them over? I think that's an impossibility. But should we win over the actual American people directly who they've been lying to? Absolutely, regardless of whether they are Democrat or Republican. One of the things that I think we in the Republican Party need to do a better job of saying, and I'll say it right now, and I'll continue to say it to any audience who will listen. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a far left progressive, it doesn't matter. You can disagree with me on what I have to say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it, because that's who we are as Americans. That's part of what unites us. I don't hear that from the other side, and that's fine, because I'm not asking for reciprocity. I'm demanding of us leadership of where we're actually going. That's what's going to be required to save the country. And so are you going to win over? Would it be a lot easier if the corporate media didn't behave the way that it did? Of course. That's why I hold them responsible and think we need to change it.
While you were campaigning, you did something very smart, which is I want the hard question. I want the point of collision. And you would take that head on. And so I want to take some of your behavior and say, this is, I think, what has to be done for Trump if he wants to actually unite the country. And that would be, you gave a guy a microphone, said, I'm going to let you talk for 60 seconds. He came there to jeer and try to shut down your event. I'm going to give you the microphone, say what you want to say for 60 seconds. I'm going to be respectful to you. You be respectful back to me. And that's one way to do it. You've talked about how, okay, the whole setup of all this brought out the fighter in me. And in the second debate, all people saw was a fighter. And if I had to do it over again, I would very much show a more well-rounded side of me. What I think people see with Trump, and rightfully so, is that you have a guy who either relishes the fight and just isn't bothered, and so he leans into it, and that is sort of in and of itself divisive. And like saying that our revenge is going to be success. I actually really get the phrase. However, it's still leveraging this idea of revenge. So when he says success, are we talking about, and now we're going to go political lawfare them to death? Like now I'm going to sue all of them and ha ha ha. Like,
I think we mean joint success and prosperity as a nation, and putting the politics of retribution through the justice system to the past where it belongs.
Now him saying something like that would be unbelievable. And then the coup de grace, the one that matters more than anything, is what's going to be his rhetoric around the election, and if I lose, did I lose fair and square? And this is one, and people are going to light me up for this, but if actually trying to unify the country was my shtick, I would be like, here are the 7 things, whatever, the 42 things, I don't know. But here are all the things that I think lead to shenanigans around, using your word, around elections that really must be cleaned up. Otherwise, democracy's on shaky ground. However, no matter what, I'm going to abide by however this plays out. And I just want everybody to know up front, that's how this is going to be. That, I don't think constitutionally he's capable of it. But that kind of thing, now, man, you want to talk about laying down the, what is it that the dove brings you? The olive branch, olive branch. That just feels like a needed thing.
So here's what I will tell you. There's a couple of things I'll say in response. One is to just address the election point. I think one way to unite the country on this issue is to demand something of everybody across the board, which is Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory and actually participates in the primary process. They have people in Congress who don't have a vote on the floor, but do have a vote in committee. So it's part of the process integrated in the United States. The way they run their elections is single day voting on election day. They make it a actual holiday, a workday holiday, so everybody can participate. If you have paper ballots, if you have not voted 1 year, then you have to re-register to get on. So that way you don't have other people on the voter roll that shouldn't be. They even have you stick your finger in a die, invisible die, like you do at an amusement park, such that they don't have people showing up at multiple polling locations to vote. If Puerto Rico can do that, and they have high confidence in their election results as a result, If Puerto Rico can do that, we can do that across this country. And by the way, let's talk about national unity. We don't take any minutes of a day, let alone a full day anymore, to just pause and think about, here's what it means to be American. Now, Memorial Day is one of those days. We just passed the Memorial Day holiday. One of the most meaningful things I did was we joined a community here in Ohio for about an hour and a half from where I live for doing the full Murph, honoring a great patriot who sacrificed his life for this country, but by doing a workout that brought us together in common purpose, in pursuit of excellence, in pursuit of feeling good, not only about ourselves, but about our country. That's a small example. Imagine if we turned Election Day into that every year, to say that this is the day where we celebrate that you get to express yourself at the ballot box where every citizen's voice and vote counts equally, and that you take a day off work to commemorate that act. And it's not just taking a day off and asking you to reflect on it. You have a civic duty that you're actually expressing, that by the end of that night or the next morning, you will know who you elected because you participated in it. That's a beautiful thing that brings the country together too. So here would be my commitment. I think it's a great commitment for Republicans to embrace is here's the deal we're doing to move the country forward on this issue. Let's do it the way Puerto Rico does in the rest of the United States. And by the way, I think our friends in Puerto Rico would appreciate saying it this way. Single day voting on Election Day as a national holiday with paper ballots, government issued ID to match the voter file. And I would go so far as to say English is the sole language that appears on a ballot. But even if you take that last one off, do the other 5 things. If we get to that place as a country, then we, and hopefully all parties, but the Republican Party included, are done, fully done, complaining about election security or contested election results. We're done. We're moving forward as a country. That's a commitment we're all making to each other. Is it controversial to have single day voting on Election Day as a national holiday with paper ballots and government issued ID? I don't think it should be controversial. I think most people on the left, if you ask them on a given day, is that a reasonable way to conduct elections? They'd say yes, for the same reason Puerto Rico actually does it that way today as part of the U.S. system. I think that's the stuff of uniting a country, which is on one hand, delivering substance that everybody on first principles should agree with, yet on the back of that, making a commitment to say that I don't care what the other side is going to do. My side isn't going to complain about those results going forward. I think it's a great way to go. Now, we have a chicken and egg problem to get there, right? Because the current election is not going to be conducted that way. You have to have decisive victories in that election to be able to create that system. So then there's the question of what leader or combination of leaders get us there. If you go to the stuff of the Old Testament, right? There's a time for David, there's a time for Solomon, right? Not every leader has the attributes of the other, but there's a time and place for every kind of leader. And the beauty of our system is we, the people, get to decide who that leader is for this moment. And the primary electorate, the Republican primary base, was clear, like not somewhat clear, as crystal clear as they've ever been probably in the history of running a Republican primary, that the time and place is for the commander-in-chief who's going to lead us to victory in what feels like a wartime moment in the country. But that's going to take action and repeatability, not just promises. We want to go with the time-tested, tried and true. But the beauty is it's also going to be people. It's not one president that just leads the country. It's going to be a whole team that brings out the best of that leadership. And so every one of us is going to have that role to play. And so I'm not one of these people that's going to wish for Donald Trump to be a different version, different person than he is. No, I want him to be the best version of himself. And then it's up to me and it's up to you for each of us to look our own selves in the mirror and say, what role are we going to play in each driving that national unity that we crave? And what I will say is I see this in Donald Trump right now. He cares about it internally. He does. And my only advice to him would be say it. Say what's in your heart, because then the people of this country can see that you really do care about national unity. And I know he does. And I think that that will be the right next step to reuniting this country. Now, my hope is it's not just the next 4 years for this country. We have another 250 years and then some left to go. And there was a time for David. There's a time for Solomon. There's a time for Trump. There'll be a time for the future. But for the next 4 years, you asked me, all of this was the product of why I threw my support behind President Trump after I ran in the race and, volunteered to get out of the race after the Iowa caucus. I'm proud that I ran a race where nobody knew who I was a year ago and, outpaced many former vice presidents and governors and senators and people who've been in politics for a long time. I'm proud of what we accomplished. But at the point it became clear that I wasn't going to be the next president, why did I throw my support behind Donald Trump? Because I think he will be the right leader for this moment, in a moment where he's tried and true, he's delivered results, and the country's hungry for those same results. And I think he is going to have an even more successful second term than his first. Because coming in as an outsider, one of the things I'm sympathetic to, even running a campaign as an outsider, is there's a million things I would do differently not having been in this world. I think the same thing applied to Donald Trump in his own first 4 years in office. He'd tell you the same thing of things that, had he known what he knows, he would have even been in a position to go even further than he did in implementing an actual unifying America First vision. And so that's what, in whatever way I can, I want to help him not only succeed, but to help him lead and reunite this country in that second term. And I think that is the best bet this country has for actually getting there.
I think the most pointed thing that you said, at least in terms of what I was trying to get to, is that you're not going to ask him to be something that he's not. You want him to be the best version that he is.
Yes.
Unfortunately, I think the best version of what he is, the introduction of chaos, the calling people out, name calling, more rhetoric. The one that I'm really worried about is more rhetoric around, if I don't win, then you can just assume the election was stolen. I think that's going to be gnarly. Now, the question becomes...
But you're very open to going in a productive direction of how we improve security in our elections. Like, let's say we did get to voter ID requirements and paper ballots this year.
Exactly how we do it, I've never thought about. Yeah. But in terms of,
I think that those details actually can matter in uniting us. If you get those basic solutions 100%. And then say, then we're not going to complain about results, that's a great way to move the country forward.
I love that. I would love an ironclad way where there was just no way to doubt. Love it, love it, love it. Yeah. Secure democracy. I'm here for that. That isn't going to happen before this election. And so I just think you are right. And that Donald Trump is popular because of the way that he is. Unfortunately, the way that he is causes a lot of division. I think that division, even if the people are wrong to react as strongly as they do, given that we've had 4 years, but knowing a lot of smart people that really believe to the core of their existence that he is an existential threat to democracy, there is going to be a seismic impact to this election. And now the question becomes, if he is sort of classic Donald, if you will, and we don't get the elimination of the language around the election could be stolen if I lose, I don't know which one is going to have a potential for more violence. He wins by a narrow margin or he loses by a narrow margin.
Let me paint a positive vision that I'm rooting for and I believe is achievable this year and is as achievable as it's been in a generation. I think this could be a 1980, 1984 style, Reagan style, unifying landslide for the country. You're seeing black voters, minority voters, young voters, all moving in a direction they haven't gone before, away from Biden towards Trump. You're seeing that in the early polling numbers. I think that understates exactly how well he could end up doing, because many people have been historically known to be reluctant on telephone polls to admit that they're actually going to vote for Donald Trump when they will. That, I think, will reveal, and I think it's at a moment where many people in those intervening 8 years since the first time he won in 2016, a lot of those people in the intervening years have recognized that they were lied to by the media. Now they try to sweep it under the rug, but everything they were told about the Russia collusion hoax that impeded the first 2 years of his presidency, all the way to even the prosecution that we're seeing in New York, I think most people look at that and say it's garbage. Say what you will about the politics of wherever you are. The idea that Alvin Bragg is bringing this case after running for prosecutor on a campaign promise of going after Donald Trump, and then goes after him for a crime that nobody can actually name. What the whole theory of the case is, he should have used campaign funds to pay for personal hush money payments. If he had used the campaign funds, they'd be going after him for that. A judge whose daughter is literally a Democratic fundraiser, raising millions off of fundraising pleas tied to the trial that her own father's presiding over. I think most people regard that as a farce. And so we live in a moment where, despite all of what we've gone through, a positive result that could come out of it is a unifying landslide election in this country. And a message that I want to see, and I think Donald Trump is delivering, but I want to see him continue to deliver it, is America First includes all Americans. Multi-ethnic, working-class coalition of people who might have been Democrat before. Who cares? Doesn't matter. Donald Trump himself was Democrat-oriented before, too. To say that, and as Ronald Reagan was, too, by the way, to be able to say that we're Americans first, that will call the bluff of that managerial class in the media, creating this projection of division if we have that landslide election. And then even for the election integrity concerns, a landslide minus some of those irregularities would still be a decisive victory. That's what I'm rooting for. And so I'm not just a passive analyst here looking at this and the distribution of possible outcomes and tell you which ones I worry about and which ones I don't. I hopefully, like all of us actually, am an agent and want to do everything I can to get to what I think will be the right, unifying, reviving outcome for this country. And I believe that is possible. And I believe that 7 months from now, we will be in a place looking back at all of the division you've looked at and say that, hey, how does it feel cathartic to have that in the rearview mirror? And now we go back to asking what is possible in the United States of America to once again be the healthiest nation on planet Earth, to be the most prosperous nation on planet Earth, to be a nation where people have rights that are unimaginable in other countries, but are unified by our commitment to exercise those rights and to speak our minds, even if we disagree with each other, to say that we're united in that common cause as Americans. It's January. It's not that far from right now where I believe that result is achievable for this country. And so is that going to happen automatically? No. But am I going to do everything in my power through politics and through the private sector, by the way, in the meantime, to maximize the chance we get there? That's all I can do. Right? That's all you can do. We're not just passive agents analyzing what happens in the world. We have the ability to shape and change that world, to make the sacrifices that our founding fathers did. It's easy to sit here and laud them. It's harder to do what they did. 56 of them signed the Declaration. 12 of them had their homes burned to the bottom. They were ransacked and burned by the British. 5 of them were captured by the British and tortured until their deaths. Most of them, many of them certainly died bankrupt because they had their private property seized. 9 of them died in the Revolutionary War. 3 more of them had their kids die in the Revolutionary War. Freedom is not free. It comes with some level of sacrifice. The unity and the existence of the United States comes with some level of sacrifice and commitment. And so I think it's easy to assume this is just Donald Trump's job or somebody else's job and to sit here and worry externally versus doing what people like you are doing. That's why I was looking forward to this conversation with you. We're each, I mean, you're doing it through impact theory, but we're each doing it in our own way. For me, it's a split between politics and the private sector. For some people, it's just going to be through family life. I took my son to a t-ball game last night. I look at the coach and his wife and the effort they put in, not far from where we're having this conversation right now, to bring that community together. That's a sacrifice that I'm not making, but we're making a different sacrifice. And so that's what I think the moment calls for right now, is every one of us taking some level of responsibility rather than expecting somebody else to do it for us. And does Donald Trump have his responsibility to do it as well, to unite this country and could possibly have the biggest impact in doing it? Yes, he does. And when I talk to him and when I think the other people around him talk to him, they're telling him, don't be something that you're not, but be who you actually really are. With a media that is distorting what you have to say, you have to work doubly hard to show the people what's actually in your heart. And if he does that, and if every one of us is able to do it in the meantime, I think we will get to that good outcome that I'm rooting for. And that's what I'm hopeful for. And if not, I am worried about the future direction of this country. I think we are skating on thin ice. So I'm not going to glide over that possibility. I'm not going to tell you that it's morning in America right now. It's not, but it can be. And that's what gives me my purpose and motivation over the next year to make sure we get to that place. And then after that, we'll turn to what happens 4 years and 8 years and 12 years from now after that.
This has been amazing. Where can people keep up with you?
Yeah, just social media. Follow me at, you can find me, Vivek G. Ramaswamy on X. My first book was Woke Inc. It's a great way to sort of get to know me. Follow Strive, company that I founded as well. It's an expression of values that are really important to me. And if I'm doing my job on Buzzfeed or some of these other fronts, I'm not going to be too hard for you to find. But we'll keep having open conversations like this. I learned a lot through this exchange, even jotted some of this down, and hopefully we can do this again.
I look forward to it. All right, everybody. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace.
If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
We are being naive, not at least publicly entertaining the possibility that our antagonists abroad would take advantage of our famous lack of security. And you're going to see why we have to talk about genocide. Somebody has to open these topics if we are